Hello guys, welcome to Super Harry. Today we have an incredible story for you. Hogwarts wards expelled Weasleys after finding 980 illegal blood contracts hidden by Dumbledore. If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, The Stones Remember the Owls came at midnight. Not one owl, dozens of them, streaking across the black September sky like thrown sparks, wings beating in patterns that had nothing to do with Hogwarts post and everything to do with something far older and far more unsettled. Harry Potter was awake to see them. He'd been awake for an hour already, sitting on the windowsill of his sixth-year dormitory with his knees pulled up and his glasses slightly crooked, watching the lake because the lake was dark and quiet and asked nothing of him. The owls confused him. They weren't carrying letters. They were just flying, circling the castle in tight, agitated spirals, and occasionally one of them would land on a parapet and scream once, sharply, like it had touched something hot. Harry watched them for a while. Then he watched the castle walls. The stones were glowing. Not brightly, not the way a torch glowed, or a spell. It was more like the faint phosphorescence you sometimes saw on the surface of the lake on warm nights, a cold blue-white shimmer that moved through the mortar lines between the stones in slow, rhythmic pulses. It came from deep within the walls, moving outward, and when it reached the surface it spread across the stone face like frost spreading across glass. Harry had lived in this castle for 5 years. He knew it better than any house he'd ever been in. He knew which stairs vanished on Thursdays, which suits of armor told filthy jokes if you said the right word, which portraits were genuine friends and which ones would report you to the nearest professor if given half a chance. He knew the sounds the castle made at night, the low structural groan of ancient settling stone, the distant ghost choir that sometimes drifted up from the dungeons, the specific creak of the 7th-floor corridor that meant the Bloody Baron was restless. He had never seen the stones glow. He dropped from the windowsill, shoved his feet into his trainers without untying them, and went to wake Neville. Neville Longbottom had a particular talent for waking up already alarmed, as though some part of his sleeping brain was always braced for bad news. He sat up immediately when Harry shook his shoulder, eyes wide, hands gripping his duvet. What? What happened? Did someone? Nothing happened yet, Harry said quietly. Come look at something. They stood together at the window for a full minute, watching the castle walls breathe their cold blue light. Neville's mouth opened slightly. Then he said, in a voice that was very careful and very controlled, Harry. I think those are the ward stones activating. Which means what? It means the castle is doing something it hasn't done in, Gran mentioned this once. Said Hogwarts runs a full ward renewal every 50 years or so. The old magic under the foundation cycles through every enchantment, every charm, every binding that's ever been laid into the castle. Checks them. Renews them. He paused. She said last time it happened was 1945. Harry looked at him. 1945, yes. Which would make the next renewal, now. Neville met his eyes. Give or take a couple of years. Right, Harry said. He looked back at the glowing walls. So the castle is doing a sort of audit. I suppose that's one way to put it. And is that dangerous? Neville considered this with the thoughtful seriousness he brought to everything involving ancient magic. Gran said it was loud, he said finally. She didn't mention dangerous. She said the castle gets particular. About who it lets in. About what it finds in its walls. He tilted his head slightly. She said the 1895 renewal expelled 3 families from the grounds and refused to let them back for a decade. Harry turned this over in his mind. Below them, the lake had gone completely still, its surface reflecting the pulsing glow of the castle walls so that the water itself seemed lit from beneath. The owls kept circling. I'm going down, Harry said. Neville didn't argue. He just reached for his own shoes. They made it 3 corridors before the castle stopped them, not with a locked door or a charm, but with a sound. It came from the walls themselves, from the stones, a low resonant hum that Harry felt more in his chest than heard with his ears. It wasn't threatening. It was, if anything, almost patient. Like something enormous waking up slowly and choosing to be calm about it. The portraits in this corridor had all gone silent. The painted occupants sat very still in their frames, watching the walls the way animals sometimes watched the sky before a storm. Sir Cadogan had abandoned his usual bluster and was kneeling in his portrait, both hands pressed to the painted stone floor of his scene, head bowed. Harry had never seen Sir Cadogan kneel for anything. "Should we keep going?" Neville whispered. The hum shifted pitch, just slightly. It felt like an answer. "Yes," Harry said. He wasn't sure how he knew that, but he knew it the way he knew sometimes that a broom was going to respond well, or that a spell was going to land exactly right. The castle was, well, it wasn't welcoming him, exactly. It was acknowledging him. Recognizing him the way you recognized a person you'd known for a long time and trusted, even when things were uncertain. They went down to the entrance hall. By the time they arrived, McGonagall was already there, standing in the center of the great flagstone floor in her tartan dressing gown with her grey hair loose around her shoulders. She held no wand. She was simply standing with her hands clasped behind her back, looking at the wall above the main doors, where the glow was brightest. Filch stood near the stairs to the dungeons with his cat Mrs. Norris tucked under one arm, both of them frozen with an identical expression of frightened fascination. McGonagall turned when she heard them. She looked at Harry specifically, and something moved across her face that he couldn't quite read, not surprise, exactly, but a kind of sharp, involuntary recognition. "Potter," she said. "Of course." "What's happening?" Harry asked. "Ward renewal." She said it the way she said most things, directly, without preamble. "It occurs every half-century. The castle's foundational enchantments review every binding, every contract, every piece of magic woven into its structure since the last renewal. Most of it is routine, the protective charms, the weather enchantments, the anti-apparition boundaries. The castle confirms them, reinforces them, and settles back down." She paused, and her jaw was doing the tight thing it did when she was choosing her words with great precision. "This one appears to be taking longer than usual." "What does that mean?" "It means," McGonagall said carefully, "that the castle has found something it considers worth examining." The glow in the walls lurched, suddenly, like a heartbeat stuttering. Every candle in the entrance hall guttered and went dark for half a second, and in that half second, in the cold blue wash of ward light, Harry saw something. Words. Moving through the mortar lines of the stone like text flowing through water, curving script that ran from floor to ceiling and back again, looping through the walls in patterns that suggested enormous complexity and enormous age. He stepped toward the nearest wall and raised his hand without thinking. "Potter," McGonagall started. His fingers touched the stone, and the words stopped moving. The whole castle went quiet. The hum dropped to silence. Outside, the owls stopped circling and landed on the towers all at once, 100 pairs of amber eyes watching the castle walls with something that looked, absurdly, like reverence. Harry kept his hand flat against the stone. The stone was warm. Not warm the way hearthstones were warm, or warm the way sun-heated bricks held their heat through the night. Warm the way a living thing was warm. And under that warmth was a pulse, slow, enormous, vast in the way the pulse of something very old and very large is vast, unhurried and absolute. He understood, in that moment, with perfect clarity, that Hogwarts castle was alive. Not metaphorically. Not in the comfortable, vague way people said beloved places had a spirit. Actually alive. The stones had memory. The walls had intention. And the magic buried in the foundations was not just accumulated enchantment, it was something that had, over 1,000 years, become genuinely aware of what it housed and who it sheltered. And it knew him. It had known him since he was 11 years old and stumbled through the doors with a hole in the knee of his trousers and second-hand school robes that didn't quite fit, and it had been paying attention ever since. Harry pressed his hand harder against the stone. "Show me," he said quietly. Not a command. A request. The light in the walls exploded. It was white this time, brilliant and sharp, flooding the entrance hall in a wash of cold radiance that made McGonagall throw up an arm and Neville stagger backward with a choked sound. The words that had been trickling through the mortar lines came rushing out all at once, filling the air of the entrance hall as visible script, curling, ancient text floating three-dimensional in the space between the walls, spinning slowly in enormous scrolling columns. Harry stood in the center of it with his hand still on the stone and read. He couldn't read all of it. Much of it was in Latin, some of it in what looked like archaic Welsh, some of it in a script he didn't recognize at all. But some of it, the newest entries, the most recent bindings, was in plain English. And what the plain English portions said made the blood drain from his face. Blood contract, operative, APWB Dumbledore. Parties, William Arthur Weasley, subject. Duration, indefinite. Terms, subject bound to maintain favorable disposition toward H.J. Potter, to provide protective proximity, to report deviations in subject's social development to operative. Blood contract, operative, APWB Dumbledore. Parties, Charles Septimus Weasley, subject. Duration, indefinite. Terms, subject bound to. Blood contract, operative, APWB Dumbledore. Parties, Percival Ignatius Weasley, subject. Duration, indefinite. Terms. Blood contract, operative, APWB Dumbledore. Parties, Frederick Gideon Weasley, subject. Blood contract, operative, APWB Dumbledore. Parties, George Fabian Weasley, subject. Blood contract, operative, APWB Dumbledore. Parties, Ronald Bilius Weasley, subject. Blood contract, operative, APWB Dumbledore. Parties, Ginevra Molly Weasley, subject. 7 Weasley children. And those were just the entries currently floating in front of Harry's eyes. He looked up, looked at the full sweep of luminous text filling the entrance hall, and understood with a sickening lurch that these 7 were a fraction. A fragment. There were hundreds of these entries. The columns of floating script stretched from floor to ceiling and higher, and every one of them that he could parse bore the same operative's initials. APWB Dumbledore. Harry stood very still. He heard Neville say, very quietly, "Oh no." He heard McGonagall make a sound he had never heard from her before, a small, involuntary, bitten-off sound, the sound of someone who has just had something confirmed that they had been desperately hoping was not true. He took his hand off the stone. The light didn't retreat this time. It stayed, not as brilliantly, but steady, the floating text remaining visible as a kind of testimony, the castle holding it there with the deliberate patience of something that has been holding its peace for a very long time and has decided, now, that it is done doing so. "How many?" Harry said. His voice came out calm. Completely, terrifyingly calm. He'd learned in 5 years of being Harry Potter that his anger came out calm, and that the calmer it was, the deeper it ran. McGonagall didn't answer immediately. She was reading the nearest column of floating text with an expression on her face like someone watching a building fall down slowly. "The ward stones will have the full count," she said. "That is part of the renewal process. The castle tallies every active binding within its walls and its grounds." She stopped. "Harry. I want you to listen to me carefully. What you're reading, how many?" Harry said again. The walls hummed softly. A number appeared in the air in front of him, burning in blue-white light against the darkness of the entrance hall. 980 blood contracts, Harry said, reading it aloud, because sometimes your brain needed to hear the words to accept them. 980 people bound without their consent. By Dumbledore. He paused. In Hogwarts Castle. Harry, the castle knew. He turned to look at McGonagall. It's been keeping record of all of them. For, how long? Some of these dates go back decades. The castle recorded every single one and held the record in its foundations, and it waited. It waited for a renewal, because that was the only time it was strong enough to act on what it knew. McGonagall met his eyes, and Harry had the sudden uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing him very clearly, not the difficult student, not the famous boy, not Dumbledore's chosen weapon, but just Harry, standing in the ward light, figuring out something enormous with a terrible efficiency. "Yes," she said. "That is very likely accurate. Is there anyone in the castle who doesn't know blood contracts are illegal?" "No," she said. Her voice was very controlled. "There is not. So Dumbledore committed 980 illegal magical bindings, hid them inside the foundation enchantments of a school, and the school just waited 50 years to have the standing to do something about it." Harry looked at the glowing walls. "And now it's renewing, and it has the standing." The castle, at that point, decided it agreed with his summary, because the ward light shifted, pulled back from the walls, concentrated itself, and moved toward the main doors. Not rapidly. Deliberately. The great iron-banded oak doors of the entrance hall swung open of their own accord, letting in the cool September night air, and the ward light flowed outward across the stone steps and down the path toward the grounds. Then it stopped. Then it pulled. "What is it doing?" Neville said. The light was pulling at something. Tugging. Like a tide going out and taking things with it. It flowed across the grounds in blue-white sheets, moving toward the dormitories, toward the towers, and then figures began appearing in the doorways of the castle's corridors. Students, blinking and confused, stumbled out of side passages and stairwells in their nightclothes, drawn by the light or by some compulsion they didn't understand. Most of them fetched up at doorways and stopped, looking bewildered, and the light left them alone. But 7 figures, 7 specifically, came across the grounds from the direction of the towers, and kept coming, and couldn't stop. Ron Weasley came through the side entrance in his flannel pajamas with his hair sticking up sideways, moving at a stumbling half-trot as though something was pushing him firmly from behind. He had his wand in his hand but wasn't casting, couldn't cast, apparently, because when he raised it he seemed to hit an invisible resistance that stopped his arm. His face was rigid with the effort of fighting something he couldn't see. Behind him came Ginny, and even in the dark and the weird light, Harry could see she was furious, jaw set, eyes blazing, fighting every step with the focused violence of someone who was losing a tug-of-war against a mountain. Behind Ginny came a figure Harry recognized as a 7th-year student he barely knew. No, wait. He knew that walk. Fred. And behind Fred, George, both of them for once completely silent, wearing identical expressions of cold assessment that Harry had never seen on their faces before. They looked, in that moment, nothing like the twins he'd watched crack jokes since his first day at Hogwarts. They looked like men who were doing rapid, furious mathematics. Bill and Charlie Weasley weren't at Hogwarts, hadn't been for years, but the pull was trying to account for them too. It pressed on the spaces they would have occupied, as though the castle had a record of where they belonged and was checking those records against current reality. And then Percy Weasley stumbled out of a side corridor looking thunderstruck, because Percy was technically employed in the Ministry of Magic and hadn't been a Hogwarts student for 3 years, but the castle's reach apparently extended wherever its blood contracts did, and right now Percy was visiting for a ministry liaison function, and the wardlight found him without difficulty. All 7 Weasley children arrived at the main doors of the castle from different directions and fetched up at the threshold together, and stopped. Ron hit the threshold and couldn't cross it in reverse. He spun around, pushed toward the door from the inside, and the castle pushed back. Not roughly. Not painfully. Just absolutely and immovably. The way a wall pushed back. "What the hell is," he started. The ward light gathered itself one final time, and the castle spoke. It didn't speak in words. It spoke in the language it had used since its foundation, in a push of magical intention so clear and coherent that everyone within 100 meters of the castle understood it the way you understood a shout in a crowded room. The meaning arrived fully formed in Harry's mind and he suspected in everyone else's, these 7 carry contracts that were never consented to. This castle will not house unconsented bindings. These 7 are not expelled as students. They are not expelled as people. They are expelled as vessels for illegal magic, and they may return when the magic is addressed and not before. Then the doors swung shut. Ron turned from the other side of the now closed main doors and looked at Harry through the small iron-grilled window in the door's face. His expression was doing about 6 different things at once: shock, bewilderment, and underneath both of those, something that looked horribly like recognition. Like some part of him had always known something was wrong with the shape of his life and had been refusing to look at it directly, and now the castle had turned on the lights. Harry looked back at him. He wanted, very badly, to open the door. He wanted to tell Ron this wasn't about him, that whatever Dumbledore had done, Ron was a victim and not a participant, that nothing between them had to change, that Harry still. He stopped himself. That instinct, the immediate rush to reassure, to minimize, to smooth things over and protect everyone's feelings, where did that instinct come from? Was that him? Was it always him? Or had some of it come from a blood contract that said maintain favorable disposition toward H.J. Potter? He took one step back from the door. Ron watched him do it. Ron understood what it meant, because Ron was the most perceptive person Harry knew when he chose to be, and right now he was choosing to be, because the stakes demanded it. His face did something complicated and painful, and then he straightened his spine and nodded once, small, sharp, acknowledging, and turned away from the door. Ginny had not looked at Harry at all. She was staring at the castle wall with an expression Harry couldn't interpret, one hand pressed flat against the stone of the outer wall the way Harry had pressed his palm to the stone inside, and her hand was shaking. McGonagall appeared at Harry's shoulder. "I need to send a message to Albus," she said, very quietly, and her voice carried its own complicated freight. "He should be told what has happened before he arrives for the morning session." "He'll try to override it," Harry said. "Can he? Can he override the ward renewal?" "He is headmaster," McGonagall said carefully. "That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, finally, with a precision that suggested she was choosing truth over discretion, possibly for the first time in some years. "The ward renewal is a foundational castle function. The headmaster's authority sits on top of the castle's authority, not beneath it. During a renewal, the castle's judgments are absolute. Albus cannot override a ruling the ward stones have made until the renewal is complete." She paused. "He will find that very difficult to accept." "Good," Harry said. She looked at him sharply. "He committed 980 illegal blood contracts, Professor," Harry said. "In a school full of children. I'm not interested in making it easy for him to accept anything right now." Filch cleared his throat from across the entrance hall, where he'd remained frozen throughout all of this with Mrs. Norris still under his arm. Are the other students to remain in their dormitories, Professor?" "Yes," McGonagall said, pulling her authority back around her like the tartan dressing gown she was wearing. "Yes, Argus, sound the prefect bells. Students in their dormitories until further notice. I want a full faculty meeting in my office in 1 hour." She paused, then looked at Harry. "You'll be there, Potter." "I wasn't planning to be anywhere else," Harry said. He went back to the wall where his handprint was still faintly luminous against the stone, a ghost of heat where he'd touched it. He pressed his palm back to it, gently this time, not asking for anything. Just acknowledging. The castle pulsed once, warm and enormous and alive. "I know," Harry said softly. "I know you've been waiting." Neville was at his elbow, quieter than Harry had ever heard him. "Harry," he said. "I'm going to say something and I need you to not hex me for it." "I don't hex people who start sentences with warnings," Harry said, though he kept his eyes on the wall. "What the castle showed us, 980 contracts, all Dumbledore's, all illegal, and the Weasleys were the biggest cluster by far, weren't they? I could see that much." Neville paused. "I've been thinking about you and Ron for the last 5 years. How you met on the train. How easily you clicked. How the Weasleys practically absorbed you into their family from year 1, gave you Christmases and summers, and Molly Weasley fed you and clothed you, and, he stopped. Swallowed. Started again. Did any of it start naturally? Or was all of it? I don't know yet, Harry said. How are you so calm? Harry considered this honestly. I'm not calm, he said. I'm the opposite of calm. But going to pieces right now is useless, and I don't do useless things when there's work to do. He took his hand off the wall. The most dangerous thing Dumbledore did wasn't the contracts themselves. It was that they make you doubt everything. Every memory, every friendship, every good thing you've ever had. He made a world where I can't trust my own history. He looked at Neville. I refuse to live in that world for 1 second longer than necessary. So I'm going to find out what's real, and I'm going to do it fast, and I'm going to be absolutely bloody furious about it while remaining completely functional, because that's apparently just who I am. Neville blinked. Then he said, "Okay. I'm with you." "I know you are," Harry said. "Your name wasn't in any of those contracts." "No," Neville said, understanding the weight of what that meant. "It wasn't." They went upstairs to the faculty meeting together, and the castle lit their way with a warm steady blue-white glow that asked nothing of them at all. The meeting was not, strictly speaking, meant to include students. McGonagall had sent Neville back to the dormitory at the door, gently but firmly, and Neville had gone without argument because Neville knew when a situation had exceeded its welcome for secondary participants. Harry had not been sent back. McGonagall had looked at him in the doorway with the same look she'd given him in the entrance hall, that sharp, involuntary recognition, and simply stepped aside to let him in. The faculty assembled in various states of nighttime disarray. Professor Sprout was there in rubber gardening gloves she must have pulled on automatically by reflex. Flitwick perched on a stack of cushions with his nightcap still on. Snape arrived last, already fully dressed in his usual black, which said something about either his sleeping habits or his general readiness for catastrophe. He looked at Harry with an expression that was hard to read, which was typical, but there was something underneath it that was less typical, something that looked almost like discomfort. Harry filed that away. McGonagall stood at the head of the room and laid out what had happened with clean, methodical precision. The ward renewal. The discovery of the blood contracts. The castle's expulsion of the Weasley students. The Count. She delivered it all with the steady, terrible composure of someone who had been a teacher for 40 years and had developed a professional immune system against personal feeling during meetings. But when she said the number, 980, her jaw went tight and something moved through the room that was like a wave, visible in the slight stiffening of spines, the controlled exhalations, the very deliberate stillness of hands. Snape said nothing. His eyes stayed on the table in front of him and he said absolutely nothing, and Harry watched him the way he sometimes watched chess pieces, trying to understand what Snape's silence meant in this particular configuration. "The headmaster will want to address this himself," Flitwick said carefully, in the tone of someone who is deeply uncomfortable and trying very hard to be fair. "The headmaster created this," Sprout said, in the tone of someone who has moved cleanly past discomfort and into Chapter 2, the ledger of 980. Dumbledore arrived at 7 in the morning. Harry knew he was coming before anyone announced it, because the castle told him. Not in words, the ward light simply shifted, drawing back from the main corridor like a tide pulling away from shore, and the quality of the warmth in the stones changed. It didn't go cold. It went watchful. Harry was in the library. He'd been there since the faculty meeting broke up at 3 in the morning, and he hadn't left since, and he wasn't planning to leave until he'd read every word the castle was willing to show him. Madame Pants had appeared at 4 a.m., taken one look at the floating text that the castle was projecting directly onto the reading table in front of Harry, made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a hiss, and then, remarkably, in what Harry considered an act of absolute character, pulled out a chair and sat down beside him with a quill and a fresh roll of parchment and began taking notes without being asked. "The ward record will be accessible during the renewal and approximately 72 hours afterward," she said, as though she were explaining a library cataloging system. After that the castle files it back into the foundation stones and you'd need an act of the Wisengamot to pull it out again. How do you know that? Harry asked. I have been librarian here for 31 years, she said crisply. I know things about this castle that the headmaster has never thought to ask about, largely because he has always assumed that asking a librarian questions was beneath him. She dipped her quill. Now read, and tell me which entries you want recorded in full. Harry had read straight through the night. What the castle's ledger contained was, and he kept coming back to this word, kept pressing it flat against the facts like a template against a mold, checking the fit, systematic. That was the word. Not impulsive. Not opportunistic. Not even ideological, in the simple sense. It was systematic. A managed architecture of human behavior, built over decades, serviced and maintained, with redundancies and backups and contingency clauses written into the contract terms as though Dumbledore had been running a long-term strategic campaign and treating people as its assets. The oldest contracts in the ledger dated to 1962. That was the year Tom Riddle had left Hogwarts and Dumbledore had begun to understand, really understand, what was coming. It was the year Dumbledore started building his counteroffensive, and his counteroffensive, it turned out, had been made primarily of people. People who didn't know they'd been drafted. The Weasley family contracts were particularly detailed. Molly and Arthur's own contracts, not listed under the school, but cross-referenced in the ward record because the castle's foundations had apparently catalogued connections to everything that affected its students, dated to 1969. The year before Bill Weasley was born. The terms were layered and specific: favorable disposition toward the Potter family and its heirs, proximity maintenance relative to the primary subject once identified, material sacrifice as necessary to project the impression of genuine voluntary care, and, this was the one that hit Harry hardest when he read it, suppression of individual children's independent aspiration where such aspiration conflicts with proximity maintenance. He sat with that one for a long time. Suppression of individual children's independent aspiration. Percy Weasley, who'd had ambition flogged out of him by a family that called it being pompous. Charlie Weasley, who'd gone to Romania and felt guilty about it for years. Bill, who'd gone as far as Egypt to pursue curse breaking and still came back for every Christmas because something in his blood insisted he close the distance to the family core. Fred and George, who'd channeled brilliant, genuinely extraordinary minds into pranks and jokes and entertainment, and Harry loved them for it, but the question now was whether some magical compulsion had been hurting that brilliance away from anything that might make them too independent, too separate, too far from the orbit of a boy named Harry Potter. Ron's contract was the most recent, written in 1991, before Hogwarts even started that year. It was also the most precisely written of the Weasley siblings' entries, because by 1991 Dumbledore had 11 years of additional practice and refinement. The term specified not just favorable disposition but active social support. Not just proximity but companionship. The contract specified, in language that made Harry's jaw ache from how tightly he was holding it, that Ron Weasley was to become Harry Potter's primary peer relationship, that he was to maintain this relationship through active shared experience, and that any deviations in the relationship, any serious conflicts, any drifting apart, were to be self-correcting under the contract's terms. Which explained the fights that never quite lasted. Which explained how every time Harry and Ron had a serious falling out, Ron came back. Chamber of Secrets, when Ron had gone cool and weird on him over the air of Slytherin business. Fourth year, the Triwizard Tournament disaster, when Ron had been poisonously, genuinely horrible to him for weeks, and then snapped back, suddenly, completely, as though something had reached inside him and turned a dial. Harry had always thought that was just Ron. Had been grateful for it. Had thought it meant something. He pressed his forehead against the table and breathed for a moment, slowly and carefully. Madame Pants kept writing. She didn't offer comfort or commentary, which was, actually, exactly what Harry needed. Ginny's contract was the worst. It was also the most recent, written in 1992, after Dumbledore had watched Harry for a full year and made assessments. Ginny Weasley's contract didn't specify companionship or favorable disposition. It specified romantic attachment. It used different language, it spoke of deep personal connection and intimate trust and romantic priority, but the meaning was plain. Ginny Weasley had been magically bound, at age 11, to fall in love with Harry Potter. Harry sat with that one for even longer. He'd had a crush on Ginny. Last year, it had been building into something that felt real and warm, and like something that could grow. He'd thought about it. He'd noticed her in a way that was different from noticing anyone else. Had any of it been him? Had any of it been her? Or had they both been moving toward each other on rails that someone else had laid down, thinking all the while that they were choosing? Record all of it, Harry told Madame Pants. Every Weasley entry. All terms, all dates, Dumbledore's signature on each one. Already doing so, she said calmly. And I want everything cross-referenced by year. I want to see the pattern of when he added contracts relative to events in Voldemort's history. I want to see whether the density of contracts increased after specific dates. She looked at him over her reading glasses with an expression that was almost approving. That is a precise and intelligent request. I want to know whether this was panic or planning, Harry said. And if it was planning? Then I want to know what else he planned that we haven't found yet. At that exact moment, the library door opened, and Hermione Granger walked in looking like she'd been awake all night by choice rather than by force, which was her natural state and had nothing to do with crisis. She was already dressed, hair pulled back, a bag over one shoulder, and she'd apparently heard at least a partial summary of events because her expression was the one she wore when she'd been running numbers and the numbers were bad. She looked at the floating text above Harry's table. She read approximately 4 lines of it. She sat down across from him and put her bag on the table. Tell me everything, she said. Read the table, Harry said. I'll fill in the gaps. She read for 12 minutes in silence. Then she said, Gringotts. Yes. We need Gringotts before anything else. If the blood contracts are recorded in the Castle Wardstones, they'll also be recorded in the Potter family vault records, because blood magic of this magnitude that targets a family heir would trigger automatic documentation under the inheritance laws. She was already pulling parchment from her bag. Your family vault managers need to know about this. They will have grounds to file independently with the ICW regardless of what the Ministry decides to do. The Ministry will try to manage this, Harry said. Fudge is gone, but whoever replaced him won't want the scandal of 980 contracts traceable to Dumbledore. Too much of the current power structure depends on Dumbledore's credibility. Scrimgeour replaced Fudge, Hermione said, and then stopped, and looked at him, and visibly rearranged some internal calculation. Right. You know that. Sorry. How do you know his name? I read the Prophet, Harry. All of it. Every page, including the political sections. She held his gaze steadily. I've been watching the Ministry reshuffle all summer and I have thoughts about which parts of it are Dumbledore's architecture and which parts are genuine, but that can wait. She put a fresh quill to her parchment. Gringotts first. Then the ICW. The ICW has jurisdiction over illegal blood magic that crosses family lines, and this absolutely crosses family lines, which means Britain's Ministry can't simply contain it domestically. She paused. Do you have a Gringotts contact? Someone who can be trusted with this before it becomes public. Griphook, Harry said. Hermione blinked. Griphook. The goblin who took me to my vault the first time I ever went to Gringotts, Harry said. Yes. He remembers me and I remember him, and goblins have very long memories for anyone who's treated them with basic courtesy, which apparently most wizards don't bother to do. He looked at the ledger text floating above the table. I sent him an owl 10 minutes before you came in. Hermione opened her mouth, closed it, and then said, How long have you been awake? Doesn't matter. Harry, it matters later, he said, not unkindly. Right now the renewal window is limited and I want everything out of this ledger before it closes. She looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way Hermione looked at things when she was reading them, and apparently decided that pushing him about sleep right now would be an argument she'd lose. She turned back to the floating text and picked up her own quill. "Tell me which sections you want cross-referenced," she said. "Madame Pants already has a system," Harry said. "Ask her." Madame Pants glanced up. "Chronological by contract date against a parallel timeline of documented dark activity," she said briskly. "Cross-reference by subject family and by the specified terms of binding. I am also flagging all entries that contain what appear to be self-renewing clauses, which is a level of illegal sophistication that I suspect the ICW will find particularly interesting." Hermione stared at her. "You've been here all night." "I am the librarian," Madame Pants said. "This is my library. This is information. Nothing that happens in this library is outside my purview." She dipped her quill. "Sit down, Miss Granger, and be useful." Hermione sat down and was useful. They worked for 2 hours. They had built a documented record of 412 entries in full detail and a summary count of the remaining 568 when the library door opened again and Dumbledore came in. He came alone. He wasn't wearing teaching robes, he was in deep purple traveling clothes that suggested he'd come directly from wherever he'd spent the night and hadn't stopped to change. His eyes, behind the half-moon spectacles, were the particular steady blue they always were, the eyes that Harry had spent years reading as wisdom and now read as something else entirely. The long face was composed. The silver beard was perfect. He looked, as he always looked, like a man who was in complete command of his situation. The ward light in the library went flat. Not dark, just flat. Like the stones had drawn a breath and were holding it. "Harry," Dumbledore said. His voice was warm. It was always warm. "I'm glad you're here. I've been hoping we could speak before this develops any further." "Developed," Harry said, and stood up. He picked up Madame Pants's notes, the full 412 detailed entries, and held them in both hands in a way that was not aggressive but was absolutely deliberate. "You mean developed the way 980 illegal blood contracts developed? Over several decades? While you were running the school where some of the subjects lived?" Dumbledore looked at the floating ledger text above the table. Something moved in his expression, not guilt, not yet, but a kind of careful recalibration, the look of a man deciding which angle to approach something from. "What you are reading," he said, moving further into the library with the unhurried pace of someone who has conducted very difficult conversations before, "requires context. I would very much like to provide that context before any formal steps are taken." "Context," Harry said. "These contracts were created at a time of extraordinary danger, not merely to the wizarding world, but specifically to you, Harry. Your survival required, my survival required 980 people to be magically bound without their knowledge or consent," Harry said. "My survival required Ginny Weasley to be written a contract at age 11 ordering her to fall in love with me. My survival required Ron Weasley to be magically compelled to be my friend." He set Madame Pants's notes down on the table with a very quiet, very deliberate sound. "I'd like you to explain to me, using whatever context you have available, how any of that is about my survival and not about your control." Dumbledore stopped walking. In the pause that followed, Hermione had gone very still, not looking at either of them, her quill hovering above her parchment. "You are angry," Dumbledore said. "That is entirely understandable." "You told the Weasley family to be my family," Harry said. His voice was still calm. He was very aware of how calm it was, and he was using it like a tool. "You gave them to me as a gift. Except the gift wasn't yours to give, because they were people. And the love they gave me, the Christmases, the jumpers, the dinners, all of it, you don't know if any of it was real, and neither do I, and neither do they, and that is possibly the worst thing you have ever done to any of us, including the parts where you sent me to live with the Dursleys and raised me to die." The room was absolutely silent. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, and whatever calculation was happening behind those steady blue eyes, Harry couldn't read it, but he no longer trusted his inability to read it as a product of Dumbledore's depth. He suspected now that Dumbledore's unreadability was a practiced performance. "I would like to sit down with you privately," Dumbledore said. "To explain my reasoning, no," Harry said. Dumbledore blinked. It was, Harry thought, probably a long time since anyone had said that word to him that flatly. "The castle has a 72-hour window before the ledger goes back into the foundation stones," Harry said. "I am spending that window making a complete record of every contract, every term, every name, because when this goes to the ICW, and it is going to the ICW, today, I want the documentation to be so thorough that there is no gap into which anyone can insert alternative explanations." He picked up the notes again. "If you have context you want to provide, you are welcome to provide it at the formal inquiry. I will be providing a testimony as well." Dumbledore studied him. Then, for the first time, something cracked in that composed expression, not broadly, not dramatically, but a hairline fracture along the edge of the certainty he wore like armor. "You have grown," he said, and it sounded almost like it wasn't meant to be said aloud. "I've been growing for 16 years, Harry said. "I just wasn't allowed to grow in directions that were inconvenient for your plans." He turned back to the floating ledger text. After a moment, he heard Dumbledore's footsteps on the library floor, retreating toward the door. Then Dumbledore stopped. "The castle will not permit me to access the ward record directly," he said. "I presume you already know that." "Yes," Harry said, without turning around. "You are the only person it will respond to." "Also yes." "Harry, Professor Dumbledore." Harry turned then, looked at him directly across the length of the library. "The castle chose to show me this. The castle asked me to look. I don't know exactly why me, specifically, whether it's the ward magic, or the Potter bloodline, or just that I've lived here long enough that the stones know me. But the castle asked me, and I looked, and now I know. Whatever you were planning to do with that information before I got to it, you're too late." He paused. "The owl to Gringotts is already sent." Dumbledore left. The door closed behind him with a sound that had nothing of a slam in it, which was somehow worse than if it had. Hermione put her quill down. "Okay," she said, and her voice only wobbled very slightly at the edges. "That was, Harry, are you actually all right?" "Not in the slightest," Harry said pleasantly, and turned back to the ledger. "Can you check how much of the Gringotts inheritance law you can remember? I want to know exactly what protections the Potter account has under blood contract interference clauses before Griphook writes back." She stared at him for a second. Then she opened her bag and pulled out a book that Harry suspected she'd packed specifically in case this kind of situation arose, because she was Hermione and she apparently had been preparing for a world where Harry Potter's life turned out to be a legally complex magical conspiracy. "Chapter 12, she said, opening it. "Inheritance interference and blood-targeted contracts. I read it in third year when I was researching time-turner limitations and I've been waiting for a context in which it would become relevant." "Of course you have," Harry said, with the first genuine warmth he'd felt all morning. Griphook's response arrived at noon, by a Gringotts eagle owl that landed on the library windowsill with the self-important authority of a bird that knew it represented an institution older than the British Ministry of Magic and considered itself correspondingly important. The letter was short, because Goblin financial communications were always short, and the brevity of it was its own kind of eloquence. "Mr. Potter, the matters you describe are consistent with documentation already held in the Potter Vault inheritance records. Gringotts Bank has been aware of anomalous magical interference in Potter-adjacent bloodlines since 1991 and has been awaiting a formal request from the account heir to act. You are advised that under the Goblin-Wizard Banking Accord of 1752, Article 7, Clause 3, Gringotts holds independent authority to file a complaint with the International Confederation of Wizards in cases of documented blood-targeted magic affecting account holders without consent. We will be filing today. Please be available for a vault review meeting at your earliest convenience. I will attend personally. Griphook, Senior Account Manager, Potter Family Vaults." Harry read it twice. Then he passed it to Hermione. She read it, and a smile crossed her face that was sharp and satisfied. He said they've been aware since 1991. Which means Gringotts has had documentation of this for 5 years. And they were waiting for me to ask, Harry said. Because they can't act on a living account holder's behalf without the account holder's consent. Which is, incidentally, exactly the same principle that makes blood contracts illegal. He let that sit for a moment. Dumbledore couldn't have not known Gringotts had records of this. He must have calculated that I'd never find out, or that if I did, I'd trust him anyway, Hermione said quietly. Yes. She looked out the window. Beyond the library's high Gothic panes, the castle grounds were visible, and at the edge of the grounds, just past the place where the ward boundary had pushed the Weasley children out, there were figures. Small at this distance, but there. Harry counted 7 of them, which resolved into 6 when he remembered Percy had likely left. Ron's red hair was visible even from this far away, a beacon among the muted September colors of the ground's perimeter. He's still out there, Hermione said. I know. Harry, whatever Dumbledore put in those contracts, whatever compulsion was running in the background, Ron sitting out there at the edge of the wards all morning is Ron. She turned from the window. That's not a blood contract. That's a person. Harry looked at her. Are you certain? Your name wasn't in any contract, she said. And I'm sitting in this library with you, aren't I? It wasn't a question. He looked at her for a long moment. Hermione Granger, who had walked up to him on a Hogwarts Express and told him he had a smudge on his nose and introduced herself with the particular crisp confidence of someone who was slightly terrified but refused to show it, and who had been his friend from that day forward without any magic in the world making her do it. Genuinely chosen. Genuinely given. Yes, he said. You are. She nodded, brisk. Then trust that the same capacity exists in Ron. What we're doing here isn't deciding who's real and who isn't. We're finding out the truth, and then we let people show us who they choose to be without the contracts running underneath them. She picked up her quill again. Now, I need you to ask the castle to show us the self-renewing clause entries specifically. Madame Pants flagged 63 of them and I want to understand the mechanism. Harry put his hand to the wall. The castle showed him. The self-renewing clauses were the most technically sophisticated of the contract entries, and the most revealing of Dumbledore's methods. A standard blood contract required renewal, an active magical act by the operative to maintain its terms. Self-renewing contracts were different. They contained a magical seed that fed on ambient family magic, drawing from the bloodline's own power to sustain the binding indefinitely without any action from the person who'd written them. In practical terms, it meant that even if Dumbledore had been killed, even if he had died at any point in the last 30 years, these contracts would have kept running. He had built a machine, and the machine ran on the magical energy of the people it was enslaving. That's, Harry started, and stopped. Breathtaking in its technical audacity, Madame Pants said, with the tone of someone who admired the craft and found the application monstrous. Evil, Harry said simply. Also that, she agreed. By mid-afternoon they had the full record. 980 entries, complete terms, operative signatures, dates, self-renewal notations where applicable, and Hermione's analytical summary of the chronological pattern, which showed, exactly as Harry had predicted, that the density of new contracts had spiked sharply in 1970, 1979, 1981, and 1990. Each spike corresponding, respectively, to Voldemort's first rise, the height of the First War, Harry's birth and the death of his parents, and the year before Harry started Hogwarts. Each spike corresponding to Dumbledore feeling the future closing in and tightening his grip on the people around Harry Potter. Harry asked the castle to hold the ledger accessible for the full 72-hour window, and the castle agreed with a warm pulse that felt like solid certainty. He asked Madame Pants to make 3 complete copies of the record, one for Gringotts, one for the ICW, one sealed and held in the library under wardstone protection. She was already on the second copy before he finished the request. He went outside. The September afternoon was cool and sharp, the kind of day that smelled like the approach of autumn, rich with wood smoke and the faint iron scent of the Black Lake. The castle grounds were empty of students. McGonagall's lockdown was still holding, but at the boundary of the wards, which showed itself as a subtle shimmer in the air, a curtain of visibility that hadn't been visible before the renewal, the Weasley children were still there. Fred and George were sitting on the ground with their backs against each other, a notebook between them that one of them was writing in rapidly. Even now, even in this, they were making something. Charlie had conjured a small fire and was sitting beside it, staring into it with the focused patience of someone who had spent years working with creatures that required stillness and time. Bill was on his feet, pacing in a short, controlled line, and had been, Harry suspected, for most of the day. Percy was gone, as Harry had expected. Percy's relationship to this family and this situation was complicated by layers that would take time to unpick. Ginny sat apart from all of them, further along the boundary, on a low stone wall that bordered the edge of the grounds. She wasn't looking at the castle. She was looking at her own hands. And Ron was at the center of it, closest to the shimmer, sitting on the damp grass with his knees up and his elbows on them, and he was looking at Harry. Harry stopped at the shimmer line. Close enough to talk without shouting. "How long have you been sitting there?" he asked. "Most of the day," Ron said. His voice was even. A little hoarse. "You should eat something." "Harry," Ron said, and there was something raw in it that he was working hard to keep controlled, "I need to know. What's in the contracts? The ones with my name." Harry looked at him. At the face he'd known since he was 11 years old, the familiar angles of it, the freckles, the particular way Ron held his jaw when he was refusing to flinch from something. And he made a decision. He told him. All of it. The date of Ron's contract, before first year. The specified terms. The self-renewing clause. The precision of the language about primary peer relationship and self-correcting conflict resolution. He told it plainly, without softening it, because Ron deserved the plain truth, and because Harry had a feeling that soft truths were actually the cruelest kind. Ron listened without moving. When Harry finished, Ron looked away, out across the grounds toward the lake, and was quiet for long enough that a pair of thestrals moved between the trees in the middle distance, visible to Harry and apparently to Ron as well, their dark skeletal shapes moving with elegant unconcern for the human drama happening near the wards. "The fight fourth year," Ron said at last. "When I was horrible to you about the tournament." "Yes. I came back. I know. I didn't know why. I remember it snapping. Like a rope pulled too tight and then it released, and I felt like an idiot for being angry and came back. And I thought," he stopped. "Worked on something for a moment. I thought it was just me. Growing up. Deciding what mattered. But it wasn't. It was a contract pulling the slack back in." "Probably," Harry said. "Some of it might have been you." "Might have been," Ron repeated. "Right." He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. Does it bother you? That it might not have been real?" Harry thought about it. Really thought about it, not the reflexive answer he could have given. "What I think," he said slowly, "is that the contracts don't unmake the memories. We still did everything we did. We still went through everything we went through together. Even if the first meeting was engineered, we lived 5 years after it, and I don't think magic can fabricate 5 years of someone choosing to show up every day." He paused. "But I also think you deserve the chance to find out who you are without a contract running underneath you. And when you do, when it's actually you, choosing, with nothing else in the way, then I'll know." Ron looked at him directly. "And you'll trust that?" "Yes," Harry said. Ron held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, small and sharp, the same nod he'd given through the door last night. "Okay," he said. "How long before the contracts are formally dissolved?" "Depends on the inquiry. Hermione thinks 2 weeks at most if the ICW moves quickly. Gringotts has already filed." 2 weeks. Ron looked at the shimmer. I can't come back inside until they're dissolved. The castle says no. Ron accepted this with the particular grim pragmatism that Harry had always loved about him, the ability to look at a bad situation and immediately ask what the parameters were, rather than collapsing into the badness of it. Right then. Tell Hermione I'll need her to send my schoolbooks out. He glanced at Fred and George. And Fred says he wants the notes from the ward record specifically, the self-renewal mechanism. He has thoughts. What kind of thoughts? Ron's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile but close. The kind that would make Dumbledore very unhappy. I'll get him the notes, Harry said. He stood there for a moment longer, with the shimmer between them and the September afternoon going golden around the edges and the castle at his back, breathing its slow enormous breath. Then he said, Ron. Whatever you find on the other side of those contracts, the version of you that's just you, completely, with nothing else running, I reckon I'm going to like him. Ron looked at him. Something moved through his face that was too complicated to name. Yeah, he said finally, a little rough. I reckon you might. Harry turned back to the castle. The stones were warm when he stepped inside, warm and alive and paying close attention, and the ward light moved with him down the corridor as he walked, a steady blue-white companion at his shoulder, illuminating the path ahead. Behind him, through the thick old walls, he could feel the castle watching its boundary. Protecting what was inside it. Waiting for the inquiry that was coming. 980 contracts. 1 formal record. 1 filing with Gringotts already in motion. 1 filing with the ICW arriving within hours. And Dumbledore, somewhere in this building, running numbers on a situation that had, for the first time in 30 years, moved completely outside his control. Harry went back to the library. There was more work to do. Chapter 3, The Weight of Honest Words. The inquiry was convened in 3 days. That was fast, by ICW standards, insultingly fast, by ministry standards, which was exactly the point. Gringotts had not filed a routine complaint. They had filed under Article 7, Clause 3 of the 1752 Accord, which was the nuclear option of Goblin financial law, and they had attached to it a 30-page supplementary document that the senior account managers had apparently been building quietly for 5 years while waiting for Harry to ask the right question. The ICW's response had been rapid and unambiguous, an emergency tribunal, convened at Hogwarts itself, because the ward stones were evidence and the ward stones couldn't be moved. 3 ICW senior adjudicators arrived on Wednesday morning in formal robes that were a deep, authoritative silver gray. Their names were Adjudicator Rosenberg from Frankfurt, Adjudicator Nakamura from Tokyo, and Chief Adjudicator Delacroix from Paris, no relation to Fleur, as far as Harry could tell, though they shared the same quality of absolute composed certainty. They set up their tribunal in the Great Hall, which the castle accommodated by rearranging its furniture with quiet efficiency. The 4 house tables slid back to the walls. A long bench appeared for the adjudicators. Witness chairs materialized facing the bench with the solemnity of furniture that understood its purpose. Dumbledore was present. He sat in a chair to the right of the chamber, not at the witness bench yet but clearly waiting his turn, dressed in his most formal robes, deep blue, silver embroidery, the collected gravity of a man who had accumulated so much institutional authority that it hung on him like a physical object. He was talking quietly to a ministry legal representative who had arrived that morning looking personally miserable about the whole situation. Harry knew the legal representative had been sent not to defend Dumbledore but to manage the narrative, to ensure that whatever came out of this inquiry remained, in some official sense, controllable. Harry looked at the ministry lawyer once, assessed him, and dismissed him. The man was damage control. He was not the issue. Hermione was in the gallery with Neville, both of them with complete copies of Madame Pance's documentation on their laps. They'd been up until 2 in the morning organizing the presentation, and Hermione had cross-referenced the ICW statute books against each specific contract type with a thoroughness that would have been intimidating even to the adjudicators themselves. Neville had memorized the key dates and figures at Hermione's insistence, because, as she had said while drilling him at midnight, if something happens to the parchment, one of us needs to be the parchment. McGonagall sat at the faculty side of the chamber looking like a woman who had made several very difficult decisions in the past 3 days and was at peace with all of them, which Harry recognized as a particular and hard-won kind of courage. Snape was not present. His absence said something. Harry wasn't certain yet what. Chief Adjudicator Delacroix opened the session with the precise efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 30 years and had no patience for theatrical preamble. She was a small woman with close-cropped white hair and dark eyes that moved through the room taking inventory of everything in it the way a chess player assessed a board in the opening seconds of a game. This tribunal is convened under ICW Emergency Powers, Article 7, in the matter of documented illegal blood-targeted magical contracts discovered during routine ward renewal at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, she said, her French accent giving the formal language a precision that the English would have blurred. The ward stones of this institution have been accepted as primary evidence under the precedent of Grimoire v. European Council of Magical Governance, 1887. The record produced by the ward renewal is considered an unimpeachable magical testimony. This tribunal will hear supporting witness accounts to establish context, intent, and scope. She looked up from her documents and looked directly at Harry. We will begin with the statement of Harry James Potter, as the individual to whom the majority of the contracts were targeted, and the individual to whom the castle's ward record was revealed. Harry stood up and walked to the witness chair. He was 16 years old. He was wearing clean school robes and his glasses were straight. He had slept, finally, 6 hours the night before, because Hermione had stood over him with the particular implacable authority she reserved for situations where she was right and she knew it and arguing was a waste of everyone's time. He felt clear. He felt the specific clarity that came from having made all the decisions that needed making before a confrontation, so that when the confrontation arrived there was nothing left to decide, only things to say. Please state your name and your relationship to the contracted parties for the record, Adjudicator Nakamura said. He was a quiet man who looked like he was always listening to something slightly beyond what was audible in the room. Harry James Potter. The blood contracts were targeted at people in my immediate social environment, my closest friends and what functioned as my substitute family, for the purpose of engineering my upbringing and relationships in a direction that served a specific strategic plan. Harry paused. The contracted parties are the victims of this situation. I want that on the record first, before anything else. Delacroix made a note. Noted. Please proceed with your account from the night of the ward renewal. Harry told it. He had the entire sequence in his mind with the clean linearity of something he'd gone over many times since the night it happened, and he told it without decoration and without drama. He told them what the stones showed him, what the ledger contained, what the numbers meant. He told them about the Weasley family contracts, the dates, the terms, the self-renewal mechanisms. He told them about Ginny's contract specifically, and here his voice did something very slight that he controlled immediately, a fractional tightening that he smoothed out because emotion wasn't what this testimony needed. He told them about Dumbledore arriving in the library and what Dumbledore had said. He quoted it as precisely as he could, and when he quoted the phrase "these contracts were created at a time of extraordinary danger, not merely to the wizarding world, but specifically to you, Harry," he heard a sound from somewhere in the gallery that might have been someone's breath catching. "In your assessment," Adjudicator Rosenberg said, a precise woman with reading glasses and a German directness that Harry appreciated, "were these contracts created for your protection, or for your management?" Harry looked at her steadily. "Both," he said. "I think Dumbledore genuinely believes the two things are the same. That's what makes him dangerous." Delacroix looked at him sharply. "Elaborate." "If someone binds another person for their own good and believes it, they will never stop," Harry said. "There is no point at which the end of the danger triggers the end of the control, because the person doing the controlling has redefined control as care. Dumbledore didn't write 980 blood contracts because he's cruel. He wrote them because he decided, somewhere in the 1960s, that he understood the future better than the people living in it, and that his understanding gave him the right to arrange them like furniture." He paused. The problem isn't that he was wrong about Voldemort. He was right about Voldemort. The problem is that being right about one thing doesn't give you the right to remove everyone else's capacity for choice. The chamber was very quiet. Delacroix was writing rapidly. Rosenberg had her eyes fixed on Harry with an expression he recognized as the look of someone being made to think about something they'd rather have remained uncomplicated. Nakamura had stopped writing entirely and was simply listening with his head slightly tilted, the way he'd looked all morning, like he could hear something just beyond audible. "Do you wish to attribute malice to the operative?" Rosenberg asked. "No," Harry said. "I wish to attribute something worse than malice. I wish to attribute absolute certainty. Malicious people at least know they're doing wrong. Dumbledore thinks he's doing right, and that means he'll keep doing it until someone makes it impossible for him to continue." He said it looking directly at Dumbledore. Dumbledore returned his gaze with those steady blue eyes, and for once, for the first time in 16 years of those eyes looking at him with warmth and wisdom and the particular weight of accumulated knowing, Harry looked back without flinching, without the reflex softening that had always come with that gaze, without the instinct to make room for the idea that Dumbledore probably knew best. He just looked back. Equal and direct and completely, utterly unafraid. Something moved across Dumbledore's face. Not anger. Not guilt. Something almost like grief, the way a man looks when he realizes he has lost something he didn't know he could lose. Harry turned back to the adjudicators. "I have nothing further," he said. Hermione was called second. She delivered her analytical summary of the chronological pattern with the controlled precision of someone who had practiced it until the emotion in it was directed rather than dispersed. When she laid out the evidence that the contract density spiked in correlation with specific historical events, 1970, 1979, 1981, 1990, and when she presented the inference that each spike represented Dumbledore tightening his network in response to mounting danger, adjudicator Rosenberg stopped her and asked her to repeat the 1990 data twice. "Let me understand this clearly," Rosenberg said. "You are saying that in 1990, 1 year before the subject began attending this school, the operative wrote 47 new contracts, including all of the Weasley children currently enrolled here, and that these contracts contain specific language about ensuring the primary subject's social development proceeded in a predetermined direction." "Yes," Hermione said. "That's what the ledger shows. The subject was 10 years old in 1990. "Yes." "And living with Muggle relatives." "Yes." "Who had no knowledge of the wizarding world." "Who had been specifically instructed to prevent him from having knowledge of the wizarding world." "Yes." "That's also documented. There are 3 contracts in the ledger related to the management of Harry's Muggle living environment, which I've flagged in the supplementary index." The word management landed in the chamber with a weight that silenced the room for several seconds. Delacroix looked at her notes. Then she looked at Harry, who was back in the gallery now. Then she looked at Dumbledore. "Professor Dumbledore," she said. "You will take the witness chair, please." He came to the chair with the unhurried, considered movement of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and had walked out of all of them. He sat down and folded his hands on the table and looked at the adjudicators with genuine attention, because Albus Dumbledore, whatever else he was not a man who underestimated the people in front of him. "You have heard the testimony of Mr. Potter and Miss Granger," Delacroix said. "You have presumably reviewed the ward record documentation. I would ask you to speak to your actions and your reasoning." "Gladly," Dumbledore said. His voice was everything it always was, warm, measured, weighted with experience. He spoke for 20 minutes. Harry listened to every word with the attention of someone who is listening not for what is said but for the architecture of the argument, the load-bearing structures of it, the places where the weight of justification was concentrated. Dumbledore's argument was this: the blood contracts had been a necessary safeguard against an existential magical threat. Tom Riddle, Voldemort, had been, in Dumbledore's assessment, a danger not merely to individuals but to the fabric of magical civilization itself. Harry Potter was the only identified mechanism for ending that threat, by virtue of a prophecy made in 1980. Ensuring Harry's survival and his psychological preparation for the role he was required to play had justified extraordinary measures. The contracts had not harmed their subjects, they had, in fact, given the Weasley family stability, purpose, and proximity to one of the most significant events in magical history. The emotional bonds that had grown from those compelled proximities were, Dumbledore argued, real bonds regardless of their origin, and the subjects would, given time, come to understand the necessity of what had been done. He said all of this beautifully. He meant every word of it. That was the most disturbing thing in the room, not that he was lying, but that he was entirely, completely, peacefully sincere. When he finished, the chamber was quiet again. Adjudicator Nakamura, who had been silent through both testimonies, leaned forward. It was the first time he'd moved with any particular emphasis all morning. "Professor Dumbledore," he said, in a voice that was quiet and precise and offered no comfort whatsoever, "you have described, in considerable detail, your reasoning for why the harm you caused was justified by the good you were pursuing. I do not question the sincerity of that reasoning. I have a different question." He paused. "Did you ask?" Dumbledore looked at him. "I'm sorry. Did you ask the Weasley family if they would be willing to perform this role voluntarily? Did you present them with the situation, explain the danger, and ask them to choose?" Nakamura's voice was still quiet. "You have described them as people whose bonds with Mr. Potter became real regardless of origin. If their bonds were capable of becoming real, then they were capable of choosing those bonds freely. Did you ask them?" Dumbledore was silent for 3 full seconds. "No," he said. "I did not." "Why not?" Another silence. Shorter this time, but heavier. "Because they might have said no," Dumbledore said. It was the most honest thing he'd said all day, and it was also the end of his defense. The chamber did something after that, not a noise exactly, but a shift in quality, the way a room shifts when a verdict has already been reached and everyone knows it and all that remains is the formal articulation. Delacroix wrote something long and unhurried. Rosenberg made a notation that she folded and passed to the ministry legal representative, who looked at it, went slightly pale, and looked at the floor. But then the door opened. Not the main entrance, a side door, the one that connected to the corridor toward the dungeons. And Molly Weasley came in. She was wearing her everyday robes, the patched ones, and her red hair was pulled back in the familiar knot, and she had the look of someone who had driven herself to a destination she'd been resisting for days and had arrived with the engine still running but the momentum spent. She looked at the tribunal. She looked at Dumbledore. She looked at Harry. Harry had not expected her. In 3 days of preparation he had not accounted for Molly Weasley walking into this room of her own volition, and the absence of that anticipation meant he had no prepared stance for how to look at her. So he just looked at her directly, the way he'd learned to look at things that hurt, not away from them, not at a softening angle, but straight at the center of them. McGonagall had risen slightly in her seat. The adjudicators looked at the newcomer with the attentive neutrality of people trained to accommodate unexpected developments. "I wasn't summoned," Molly said, to the room in general, with the directness of a woman who knew she was stating the obvious and stating it anyway. "I came because," she stopped. Started again. "I came because Percival came home 2 days ago and told me what was happening, and I need to say something. To the tribunal. If they'll hear me." Delacroix looked at her with those sharp dark eyes. "You are Molly Weasley, the mother of 6 of the 7 Weasley children referenced in the ward record." She lifted her chin slightly. "And as signatory to 2 of the contracts referenced therein." Another shift in the room's quality. Delacroix gestured to the witness chair. Molly sat in it with the deliberate care of someone sitting down in a place that is harder to sit in than it looks, and she looked at the adjudicators, and she said, "I knew." The words went into the chamber and stayed there. "Not everything," she said. "I didn't know the number. I didn't know about Ginny's contract. I want that noted, because that one," her voice fractured on the edge of it, and she pressed past the fracture with the sheer muscular willpower of a woman who had spent 30 years pressing through hard things. I didn't know about Ginny's. But I knew about my own. Arthur's. And I knew there were contracts on the children, and I told myself it was protection. That it was keeping them safe, keeping them close to something important, giving them a purpose they might not otherwise have had. She paused. I told myself a great many things. Harry was very still. I want to be clear about what I knew, Molly continued, and her voice was steady now in the way that was actually more painful than if it had broken, steady with the effort of someone who has decided the only thing left is precision. Albus came to me in 1990. He told me that Harry Potter would need a family, a real family, a warm and safe place to come to. He told me the Dursleys were cold and neglectful and that Harry was growing up without anyone who cared about him. He told me, she stopped. Drew a breath. He told me that the easiest way to ensure Harry had access to that family was to create a gentle encouragement. A nudge. That it wouldn't change who my children were, only ensure that they were open to the connection. She looked at her hands. I let him. Adjudicator Rosenberg said, very quietly, you consented to the binding of your own children. I consented to what he told me it was, Molly said. Which was not what it was. She looked up. I am not standing here to argue that ignorance is innocence. I knew blood magic was involved. I told myself it was a small thing. I told myself I was protecting them by making sure they were connected to something that mattered, something larger than our families. She hesitated on the word, limitations. Her eyes moved to Harry briefly and then moved away. I wanted them to be part of something important. Albus gave me a way to ensure that, and I took it, and I told myself it was love. The chamber held the silence around her words for a moment. Then Harry said, from the gallery, was it? He didn't mean it as an accusation. He genuinely didn't know. He wanted to know. Molly looked at him directly for the first time since she'd come in. Her eyes were very bright, and she was fighting very hard. I think, she said carefully, that love that lives in a cage is still love. But it isn't free. And your children, and the people your children love, they need the free kind. They deserve the free kind. She paused. And I think I knew that, and I chose the cage anyway, and I will be spending a long time understanding why. Harry held her gaze. He felt something in his chest that was complicated and not clean, the way most real things were complicated and not clean. He thought about 6 Weasley jumpers. He thought about a table that always seemed to have room for one more. He thought about the smell of a kitchen where someone had been cooking since before dawn, and a woman who pressed food on him because she could see the specific shape his hunger had, the shape that wasn't about food. He thought about what she just said, love that lives in a cage is still love. He wasn't sure yet what he thought about that. Thank you for coming, he said, which was not a verdict and not a pardon. It was just true. Delacroix looked at Molly. Mrs. Weasley. You will need to make yourself available for further questioning as the formal dissolution process proceeds. You are not a defendant in this proceeding, but your testimony constitutes relevant material and will be incorporated. She paused. I would advise you to obtain independent legal counsel. Molly nodded and stood, and walked back toward the side door, and the room let her go with the particular silence of a space that has absorbed something heavy and hasn't decided yet what to do with it. The afternoon session focused on the technical evidence. Griphook had arrived that morning. Harry had met him in the entrance hall and the goblin had given him a look of sharp professional assessment that contained within it a kind of pointed satisfaction, the satisfaction of someone who has been holding correct information for a long time and is gratified to finally have it acknowledged. Griphook's testimony was precise and merciless. Gringotts' documentation of the blood contract interference went back to 1991, when the bank's monitoring charms on the Potter vault had detected anomalous magical intrusions targeting Potter-adjacent bloodlines. They had recorded each intrusion, catalogued the magical signature, which matched Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore's registered wand signature with a 99.7% certainty, and had been, as Griphook put it with goblin understatement, patiently maintaining the record. The ministry legal representative tried twice to introduce arguments about national security exemptions and wartime emergency powers provisions. Both times adjudicator Rosenberg looked at him the way you might look at someone who has offered you a counterfeit coin, acknowledged its existence, and set it aside. By evening, the first formal ruling was issued. The blood contracts constituted violations of ICW Code of Magical Ethics, sections 14 through 19, covering unauthorized magical binding, blood-targeted coercion, and exploitation of minors through magical means. The ward renewal ledger was formally accepted as primary evidence. Dumbledore's authority as headmaster was suspended pending full inquiry, and this part the castle expressed its agreement with by immediately dimming all the lights in the corridor outside the Great Hall and then bringing them back up brighter, which was approximately as close to applause as ancient stonework could manage. The immediate dissolution of the Weasley blood contracts was ordered, to be performed by a certified ICW cursebreaker within 48 hours. Bill Weasley, who held a curse-breaking certification from Gringotts, which the adjudicators accepted with the logic that fighting Dumbledore's magic with a Weasley seemed appropriate, was designated to perform the dissolution on his siblings. As the session broke and people began to move, Harry stood in the gallery and watched the chamber empty and thought about what came next. Because this, the inquiry, the ruling, the formal machinery of justice engaging with the situation, was the necessary part, the foundation part. But it was not, he was fairly certain, the last part. Dumbledore's authority had been suspended, not destroyed. His legal standing was damaged, not eliminated. And Dumbledore had spent 60 years never losing anything he'd decided to keep. He would adapt. He would find the angle. He always did. Hermione appeared at Harry's elbow with the specific quality of presence she had when she'd been thinking through something for several hours and had arrived at a conclusion she didn't like. "He's going to argue the prophecy," she said quietly, her eyes on the chamber below. "At the full inquiry. He's going to argue that the prophecy created a genuine emergency that superseded normal legal frameworks, and that his methods, however unorthodox, were the only viable path toward the outcome the prophecy specified. He'll argue necessity." She paused. "And some of the adjudicators will find that compelling. Not Delacroix. But some." "I know," Harry said. "We need to be ready for it." "I know. The prophecy itself," she hesitated. "Harry, the prophecy was made about you. But have you ever actually heard it? The full text? Because everything we know about it is secondhand, and in a situation where everything else was engineered." Harry looked at her. He felt the implication arrive in him like a slow cold wave, because Hermione's implications generally traveled at the speed of inevitability. "You think the prophecy might have been engineered too?" "I think we should verify it independently," she said carefully. "Before Dumbledore gets to stand up in front of the full tribunal and present it as the justification for everything." Harry thought about this. He thought about the prophecy in the Department of Mysteries, the one he'd died to retrieve and then watched smash on the floor. He thought about what Dumbledore had told him in his office afterward, the full text of it, delivered in that warm and careful and irresistible voice that Harry had trusted completely. He thought about 980 contracts. He thought about a man who had spent 60 years arranging people like furniture and calling it love. "We'll need the original record," he said. "The Hall of Prophecy." "I know someone in the Department of Mysteries," Hermione said, with the particular tone of someone who has anticipated this moment and made preparations. "Professor Vector has a contact. I spoke to her this morning." Harry looked at her. "This morning? Before the inquiry session?" "Well, I wanted to be prepared," Hermione said, with complete dignity. The ward light in the gallery pulsed once, warm and approving. Harry looked down at the chamber, now nearly empty, the tribunal bench cleared, only the witness chair remaining with the solitary significance of furniture that had seen something important happen in it today. He looked at where Dumbledore had sat, composed and sincere and absolutely certain in his justifications, and he thought about what Nakamura had asked. "Did you ask?" And Dumbledore had said, because they might have said no. And that one admission, Harry thought, was the key to everything, the precise reason why the whole architecture of control had been built in the first place. Not because the people in Dumbledore's plans were incapable of the right choices. Because they were capable, and their capability meant they might choose differently, and Dumbledore could not tolerate a world in which people chose differently from what he had decided was right. It was the most complete definition of tyranny Harry had ever heard, delivered in the most reasonable voice he'd ever encountered, and wrapped in more genuine love than most people ever received from anyone. He understood now why the castle had waited 50 years to speak. Some truths needed the right witness. "Come on," he said to Hermione. "We need to start building the prophecy brief tonight, and I want to check on the dissolution preparations before bed." "I already started the brief," she said. "Obviously," Harry said. They walked out of the gallery together, and the castle lit their way without being asked, because that was what it did now, recognized the direction they were moving and made the path clear. Outside the wards, Bill Weasley was already reviewing the dissolution protocols by wandlight, a Gringotts manual open on his knee, his long fingers moving through the pages with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years dismantling exactly this kind of carefully constructed magical trap. Around him his siblings sat in the thickening September dusk, and in the last of the light Harry could see, very clearly, Ron looking up at the castle windows. Looking for him. Harry raised one hand, briefly, through the glass. Ron saw it. He raised his hand back. 2 days, Harry thought. 2 days and the castle would let them back in, and then they would find out who everyone was, uncontracted and uncompelled and genuinely free. He was looking forward to it with a fierceness that surprised him. He turned from the window and followed Hermione toward the library, where the work was, and the castle moved with him, warm and alive and paying very close attention to everything that was about to happen next. Chapter 4, What's Left When the Magic Goes. Bill Weasley performed the dissolution on a Friday morning. He did it outside, on the grounds just beyond the shimmer of the ward boundary, in the thin early light of a September day that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be autumn yet. The grass was wet. The Black Lake was perfectly still in the distance. 7 Gringotts cursebreakers stood in a support ring around the working area, not because Bill needed them technically, he was better than all of them and everyone present knew it, but because the ICW ruling required certified witnesses and the Gringotts team were the most qualified humans available on short notice. Harry stood inside the ward boundary and watched through the shimmer. He'd asked Delacroix if he could be present, and she'd said yes without apparent reservation, which told him she understood something about why he needed to see this happen with his own eyes. Hermione was beside him. Neville was a few steps back, giving them space while remaining in clear supportive range, which was exactly the kind of spatial intelligence Neville had developed over years of knowing when people needed company without intrusion. The 6 Weasley children stood in a loose arc facing Bill, who had his wand out and his Gringotts manual open on a flat stone he transfigured from a loose piece of the grounds. He was reading through the dissolution sequence one more time with the focused quiet of a professional who triple-checks things not because he doubts himself but because the work is worth precision. Fred was watching him with his arms crossed and his chin up, a posture Harry recognized as the Weasley default for being frightened and refusing to show it. George stood with his shoulder pressed against Fred's with the unconscious closeness of people who have spent their entire lives as each other's gravitational center. Ginny stood a little separate from the group, which she'd been doing consistently since the expulsion, maintaining a small deliberate distance that Harry suspected was as much about her own internal reckoning as about the practical situation. Ron caught Harry's eye through the shimmer and gave him a look that said approximately, "I know this is necessary and I hate it and I'm ready." Harry gave him one back that said, "I know." "Ready?" Bill said, looking up from the manual. "Just do it," Fred said. Bill nodded. He raised his wand. The dissolution sequence was nothing like Harry had expected. He'd anticipated something dramatic, a flash of light, a sound, some visible spectacle. What happened instead was quiet and strange and somehow much worse. Bill cast, and the air around his siblings shimmered, not the ward shimmer, but something closer, more intimate, the shimmer of something that had been woven very close to the skin peeling back. It was like watching a heat haze lift. Like watching a window get cleaned and realizing how dirty it had been. Each Weasley child went still for the duration of their individual dissolution. Not frozen, more like the stillness of someone hearing something in a very quiet room, straining to catch it. It lasted maybe 10 seconds per person. When it passed, they moved again, blinked, took breath, and looked different in a way that was entirely interior and therefore entirely visible on their faces. Charlie breathed out slowly and deliberately, the way you breathe after setting down something heavy. He turned his face toward the mountains in the distance and was still for a moment. Fred and George looked at each other. The look that passed between them was not the quick crackling shorthand of their usual communication. It was slower. More deliberate. Like two people confirming something they'd suspected in a language that only existed between them. Ron, Harry watched Ron specifically. Ron went through the dissolution, came out the other side of it, and looked immediately at Harry through the shimmer. Not with relief, not with revelation. Just with the direct, unflinching attention of someone who is checking whether the most important thing is still true. Harry didn't know what Ron saw in his face. But whatever it was, Ron nodded once, and the rigidity went out of his shoulders, and he rubbed his jaw with one hand and made a sound that was trying to be a laugh. It wasn't quite there yet, but it was trying. Ginny was last. Bill did her dissolution with the extra care he brought to structurally complex jobs, slow and methodical, because her contract had been the most deeply written and the most deliberately targeted. When it lifted, Ginny made a small involuntary sound, not a cry, just a sound, like something had moved inside her that she hadn't anticipated moving. She pressed one hand to her sternum and stood very still with her eyes closed, and nobody said anything, and nobody moved toward her. When she opened her eyes, she looked at the castle first. Not at Harry. Not at her brothers. At the castle itself, the grey towers, the ancient stone, the place that had expelled her and in doing so had given her back something she hadn't known was missing. Her expression was complicated in the specific way that honest reckonings were complicated, not simple relief, not simple grief, but both things moving through the same face at the same time looking for where to settle. Then she looked at Harry. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure what she needed to hear, and he was aware that he was possibly the last person who should be deciding what she needed, given that she'd had a magical compulsion toward him lifted about 30 seconds ago. So he didn't say anything. He just returned her look without performance, without expectation, without any of the tangle that had been building between them over the past year. She gave him a very small nod. Acknowledgement, not answer. Not yet. Bill lowered his wand. The Gringotts witnesses made their notations. The ward shimmer shifted its quality as the castle recognized that the expelled parties were no longer carrying illegal bindings. It didn't vanish, but it opened, the way a door opens, available rather than blocking. "Welcome back," Harry said. Ron crossed the threshold with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting for permission to move, and he crossed it fast, and he walked up to Harry and stopped 2 feet from him and looked at him the way you look at something you want to be sure is real. "Hi," Harry said. "Hi," Ron said. "How do you feel?" Ron thought about this with genuine attention. "Lighter," he said. "And also, angry, honestly. Not at you. Just, angry in general. Like I've been carrying something I didn't know was there and now I can feel exactly where it was." He paused. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," Harry said. "Right." Ron looked at the castle. "Can we go inside? I want to see my dormitory and I want to eat something that isn't Fred's attempt at campfire cooking, which is genuinely one of the worst things I've ever experienced." It was perfectly edible, Fred called from behind him, moving through the threshold with George. "It was hot rocks and regret," Ron said, and he was through the door and into the entrance hall before he finished the sentence, and the castle welcomed him back with a warm pulse of wardlight that made him stop and look at the walls with startled recognition. "Is it doing that because of me?" he asked Harry. "It does it for people it trusts," Harry said. Ron looked at the walls for another moment. Then he said, very quietly and not for anyone else's benefit, thanks, to the stones directly. It was so classically Ron, the instinct to acknowledge a kindness regardless of how strange the source, that Harry felt something unlock in his chest that had been very carefully locked for 3 days. The anger was still there. The questions were still there. The long, uncertain work of figuring out what was real and what had been engineered was still ahead of them. But that, Ron saying thanks to a wall because a wall had done something kind, that was not a blood contract. That was just a person. Fred and George came through the threshold side by side and stopped in the entrance hall with identical expressions of assessment, looking at the space around them the way architects look at a building they're planning to renovate. "We need to talk to you," Fred said, to Harry. "Today," George added. "About what?" The twins looked at each other. "The self-renewal mechanism in our contracts," Fred said. "The technical write-up that you sent out the second day. George and I have been thinking about it." "Thinking hard," George confirmed. "The mechanism works by drawing on ambient family magic," Fred continued. "It feeds on the bloodline's natural magical energy to sustain itself without the operative's involvement. Dumbledore basically built a perpetual motion machine out of people." He paused. "We want to understand it completely. Not to reproduce it. We want to understand it so thoroughly that we can identify any similar mechanism the moment it appears. Anywhere." Harry looked at them. At the twin expressions of cold analytical intelligence that had been mostly hidden under 6 years of spectacular mischief, the intelligence that built portable swamps and skiving snack boxes and had always been, in Harry's estimation, capable of rather more than joke products. "You want to build a detection method," Harry said. "A detection and dissolution method," George said. "Portable. Accessible. Something that doesn't require a full ICW tribunal and a ward renewal cycle to find this kind of magic." Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought about the 980 contracts. He thought about the fact that Hogwarts was one building, one school, however ancient and well-warded, and that there were dozens of magical institutions in Britain alone, hundreds across Europe, thousands worldwide. He thought about how many of those institutions had been standing for 50 years without a ward renewal. He thought about how many of them might have the same thing buried in their foundations. "Get the write-up from Hermione," he said. "And ask Madame Pants for access to the original ledger entries. She'll give it to you." He paused. "When you have something workable, show me first." Fred smiled, and it was the first full smile Harry had seen from him since before the expulsion, and it was nothing like the performance smile of the Weasley twins at their most public. It was sharper than that. More deliberate. "Knew we liked you for a reason," he said. "Probably a blood contract," George said, and then immediately, "Too soon." "Deeply too soon," Ron said from the stairs, where he was already heading toward the dormitory. Charlie had come through the threshold quietly, with the self-contained stillness that had always made him slightly separate from the rest of his family, and he stopped beside Harry briefly and looked at the castle walls with an expression that was hard to read. "Heard you talk to Ron through the shimmer," he said. "Second day." "Yes. He told me." Charlie looked at the ward light. "He said you told him you'd know who he was, when it was actually him." He paused. "I've been in Romania for 2 years feeling guilty for not being here. For not being close enough to my family. And I never understood why the guilt was so specific, why it always felt like I was failing some particular obligation rather than just, being far from people I love." He looked at Harry. "That was in the contract too." "Yes." Charlie nodded slowly. "Right." He looked at his hands. "I'm staying for a while. Not because of a contract. Because I think this family is going to need the numbers." Harry said, "Your family is lucky to have you." Charlie glanced at him with the assessing look of someone deciding whether that was genuine. Then he seemed to decide it was, and moved on up the stairs. Ginny was still outside. Harry could see her through the main doors, still standing in the September morning, and after he'd watched for a moment he went back to the door and stood just inside it without going out. Not pushing. Just making himself available. She came in on her own, eventually. Walked past him with her chin lifted and her eyes bright, and she said, "I need space, and I need time, and I need you to not," she searched for the word, hover. "Understood," Harry said immediately. She glanced at him. "I don't know what I feel. About anything. About you. About my family. She stopped. "I spent 5 years being certain that what I felt was real and specifically mine, and now I don't know which parts were and I need to figure that out without anyone waiting for an answer." "No one is waiting for an answer," Harry said. "I mean that completely." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he still couldn't fully decode. "You're being very reasonable about this. You had a contract written on you at 11 years old that told you to fall in love with a specific person," Harry said. "Being reasonable about your need for space is the absolute minimum I can do." Something shifted in her expression. Not softened, that wasn't quite the right word. More like the bracing against tension she'd been carrying loosened incrementally, enough to breathe. "Okay," she said. "Good." She walked toward the stairs and then stopped partway up and said, without turning around, "For what it's worth, I'm glad you made them show the ledger. I'm glad you pushed." A pause. "Even if some of what came out of it is going to take me a long time to sort." "Take as long as you need," Harry said. She went upstairs. Harry stood alone in the entrance hall for a moment with the ward light breathing quietly around him and the castle going about its morning business above him, the distant footsteps of students returning to routine, the creak of the first-floor corridor, the muffled sound of Peeves cackling at something 3 floors up. He thought about the 6 people who had just come back through the door. He thought about the contracts that had been wrapped around them since before some of them could walk. He thought about what it meant to have those contracts dissolved and what would grow in the space they left. He had told Ron, "I think you deserve the chance to find out who you are without a contract running underneath you." He believed that. He also believed something else, which was that the finding out process was going to be uncomfortable and nonlinear and involve a significant amount of anger, and that anger was appropriate and necessary and no one should be in a hurry to get to the other side of it. Snape found him there. He came from the direction of the dungeons, as he always did, in his habitual black, moving with the specific purposefulness that made it hard to tell whether Snape was going somewhere or merely refusing to exist passively in any given location. He stopped when he saw Harry, and something moved in his face that Harry was getting better at reading, not with warmth, never with warmth, but with an increasing recognition that there were subtleties in Snape's expressions that he'd been missing for 6 years. "Potter," Snape said. "Professor," Harry said. Snape looked at the main doors, where the faint evidence of the dissolution was still visible in the slightly altered quality of the morning light on the threshold. The dissolution was completed without complication. Yes. All 6. All 6. Snape was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the floor slightly to the left of Harry, which was what Snape did when he was thinking rather than performing. "I was not present at the inquiry," he said. "I noticed. I was unable to be present." The pause before unable was about a half-second long and carried a weight that a half-second pause shouldn't have been able to carry. "I had a conflict." Harry looked at him steadily. "Your name wasn't in the ledger," he said. It was something he'd checked specifically, and he'd been turning the implications of its absence over ever since. "Dumbledore didn't contract you." Snape looked at him directly for the first time in the conversation. "No," he said. "He didn't need to." The statement sat between them with its own particular weight. "Because you were already bound to him," Harry said carefully. "Through the unbreakable vow. Or through loyalty." He paused. "Or both." Snape's jaw moved slightly. "The vow is a separate matter," he said. "And not one I am prepared to discuss in an entrance hall." He held Harry's gaze. "What I will tell you is that I have been aware of the contract's existence for approximately 3 years. I became aware through inadvertent proximity to information I was not intended to access. He stopped. Started again, with the visible effort of someone for whom candor is a physical action. I did not report what I knew. I told myself this was because the information was not mine to act on. That there were larger considerations. That revealing it would compromise more important work. His expression shifted by increments. I have spent the last 3 days reconsidering the accuracy of those justifications. Harry said nothing, because this was not a moment that required a response. This was a moment that required space. Snape looked at the ward light in the walls for a moment. The castle did not show me the ledger, he said. It showed you. I have been wondering why. I think the castle shows people what it trusts them to handle, Harry said. Snape absorbed this. That is either a profound architectural insight or an enormous compliment directed at yourself. Could be both, Harry said. Snape looked at him with an expression that, in any other face, might have been the precursor to a reluctant smile. What are your intentions regarding the full inquiry? I intend to be thorough, Harry said. And I intend to look into the prophecy independently before Dumbledore gets to present it as justification. Snape went very still. Not the ordinary stillness of a composed person, the particular stillness of someone who has just heard something that requires immediate and careful management of their own reaction. You're questioning the prophecy. I'm verifying it, Harry said. There's a difference. Hermione has a contact in the Department of Mysteries. Snape was silent for 5 seconds. The prophecy is real, he said finally. I know this because, I know this. You do not need to verify it. I know you know it's real, Harry said. That's not why I'm verifying it. I'm verifying it because I intend to stand up in front of the full tribunal and counter Dumbledore's necessity argument, and I need to understand the exact text of the prophecy, the full, original, unedited text, in order to demonstrate whether the prophecy actually required everything Dumbledore did, or whether he extrapolated well beyond what it specified. He held Snape's gaze. Because my instinct is that the prophecy said what it said, and Dumbledore heard it and spent 60 years building around it, and that a lot of what he built wasn't required. It was chosen. And choosing to do something is different from being required to do it. Snape looked at him for a long, measuring moment. You have become considerably more dangerous in the last week, he said. I've always been dangerous, Harry said. I just stopped hiding it. He walked past Snape toward the stairs, and the ward light moved with him, and he left Snape standing in the entrance hall with whatever he was working through. The Great Hall at breakfast was a different room than it had been a week ago. Not in its physical details, the floating candles were in their usual positions, the enchanted ceiling showed an overcast September sky, the food appeared at its customary times. But something in its social architecture had shifted, and the shift was visible if you knew where to look. Word had gotten out. It had been impossible to prevent entirely, 6 students expelled by the castle and camped outside the ward boundary for 3 days, a formal ICW tribunal in the Great Hall, adjudicators in silver-gray robes eating in the teachers' dining room, and students being students. The story had moved through the castle in the approximate time it took rumor to travel at the speed of whispered conversation between classes. The version most people had was approximately correct in its broad outlines and wildly inventive in its details, which was consistent with how school gossip generally worked. The Gryffindor table received the returning Weasleys with the awkward warmth of people who weren't quite sure what the correct social protocol was for someone coming back from a 3-day magical expulsion. There was a lot of shoulder patting and slightly too much cheerful noise in the immediate vicinity of Fred and George, who managed the whole thing by being so comprehensively themselves, loud, precise, and entirely comfortable, that the awkwardness dissipated in approximately 90 seconds. Seamus Finnegan slid along the bench to make room for Ron with the simple directness of someone who had decided that the best response to a complicated situation was to move over and pass the pumpkin juice, which was the exactly correct instinct, and Harry noted it with appreciation. Ron sat down across from Harry and looked at the food the way he always looked at food, with genuine, uncomplicated enthusiasm, and filled his plate. Percy old, he said, without preamble. Harry looked at him. And? He wants to meet. Ron kept his eyes on his plate, his voice carefully level. He's been doing his own reckoning. He said, and I'm quoting here because it's the most Percy sentence ever written, he said that in light of the recently documented context for several years of interpersonal difficulty within the family unit, he would appreciate an opportunity to discuss a potential recontextualization of previously held positions. He looked up. Which I think means he's sorry and he wants to come back. Harry said, are you going to meet him? Ron ate a piece of toast. Yeah, he said, with the quiet decisiveness of someone who has made a difficult choice and made it cleanly. Yeah, I am. Because Percy, he stopped, worked something through, continued, Percy spent 3 years separated from us and we all thought it was because he was pompous and ambitious and chose his career over his family. And maybe some of that was true. But his contract was specifically written to suppress independent ambition, and he pushed back against it anyway, and it cost him everything, and none of us, his jaw tightened briefly. None of us asked why. We just let him go. Harry was quiet. The contract was suppressing who he actually is, Ron said. And the way he reacted to that suppression was by pushing in the direction of what was being suppressed, because Percy doesn't do anything small. So he went hard at the ministry and the career and all of it, and the family read that as betrayal, and it wasn't. He put his toast down. I'm meeting him Saturday. Do you want company? Harry asked. Ron looked at him, and for a moment the question was doing multiple things at once, not just asking whether Ron wanted Harry there as a buffer, but implicitly asking whether Harry wanted to be there, whether Harry was choosing the involvement rather than defaulting to it. Ron heard all of that, because Ron always heard the things underneath the things when he paid attention. Yeah, he said. Come. But let me do most of the talking. Obviously, Harry said. They ate breakfast while the ceiling shifted from overcast to briefly, defiantly blue, and around them the great hall moved through the rhythms of a school morning, the sound of cutlery and conversation and distant owl arrivals and someone on the Ravenclaw table laughing too loudly at something, and it was familiar, and it was good, and it was also different now in the way that things are different when you see them clearly rather than through a lens that someone else has ground for you. After breakfast Harry went to find Fred and George. He found them in their dormitory, which was less a living space than a working laboratory with beds in it. Every horizontal surface held something, notebooks, ingredient jars, loose pages of calculations, a blackboard they'd somehow acquired and mounted against one wall that was currently covered in dense runic notation. They were both cross-legged on Fred's bed with the dissolution right up between them, talking in the rapid-fire shorthand that meant they were in genuine working mode rather than performance mode. They looked up when Harry came in. The mechanism is elegant, Fred said immediately, no preamble. Horrible, but elegant. It draws on resonant family magic, not the individual's magic, but the family's shared magical resonance. That's why it self-renews. The Weasley family magical resonance is strong because we're a large family with a long magical lineage, and Dumbledore exploited that. So the stronger the family magic, the more robust the contracts, Harry said. The more sustainable, George corrected. He'd have targeted large families with strong bloodline connections specifically. Small families, or families with weak collective resonance, the contracts would have required active maintenance and would have been higher risk for detection. He picked up the notebook he'd been writing in by the ward boundary. We've been cataloging the families in the full contract list. The pattern is consistent, every high-count family in the ledger has a documented strong magical lineage. Harry looked at the blackboard. What are you building? A diagnostic, Fred said. Something that reads the quality of voluntary versus resonant-fed magical binding. Like the difference between, okay, you know how you can tell the difference between a charm cast on something versus a charm that's been fused into the object's core material? One of them sits on top and the other one is structural. Yes, Harry said. Same principle. Blood contracts fed by family resonance have a specific quality when you scan for it. They sit in a particular way relative to the individual's own magical signature, slightly offset, like a shadow that doesn't quite match the shape casting it. Fred tapped the blackboard. We're writing a diagnostic spell that specifically scans for that offset quality. Portable. Single incantation. Harry looked at the notation on the blackboard. He wasn't an expert in runic magic, but he'd been paying attention to things like this his entire education, and what he saw on the blackboard was precise and carefully constructed and significantly more sophisticated than anything that was supposed to come out of a sixth-year dormitory. When can you have a working version? He asked. Working prototype by end of the week, George said. Reliable, tested version, 2 weeks, if we can use some of the ward stones as calibration sources. I'll ask the castle, Harry said. Fred looked at him with the sharp, assessing intelligence he mostly kept behind the comedy. You know the castle responds to you in a way it doesn't respond to most people, he said. It wasn't an accusation. More like a scientist noting an interesting variable. Yes, Harry said. Why do you think that is? Harry thought about this honestly. I think, the castle is a very old living thing, and it pays attention to intent. I've been living here since I was 11 and caring about this place as a home since the first time I saw it, and caring about the people in it, and I think the castle knows the difference between someone who's using it and someone who loves it. He paused. And I think the ward renewal gave it the standing to act on what it knows, and it chose to act toward me because I had the clearest interest in the truth and the least investment in maintaining the status quo. Fred and George both looked at him for a moment. Also, Fred said, you touched the wall and asked it to show you, and most people would never think to do that. Also that, Harry agreed. He left them to their work and went down to the castle's lower levels, to a part of the foundations he'd never had reason to visit before the renewal, a chamber below the main floor where the ward stones were physically accessible, great slabs of ancient granite carved with layered runic notation that glowed faintly in the permanent torchlight. It wasn't on any student map. The castle had shown him the route the morning after the renewal, and he'd visited twice already. He put his hand on the nearest ward stone. The castle pulsed. He felt the 72-hour window, still open, though narrowing. He'd gotten everything from the ledger that he needed. Madame Pansa's copies were complete, secure, and distributed. The Gringotts filing was active. The ICW process was in motion. But there was something else he wanted to ask while the castle was still in this state of heightened awareness. Something that had been sitting in the back of his mind since Hermione had asked whether the prophecy might have been engineered. The prophecy, he said quietly, to the stone. Was it real? When Dumbledore heard it, was there a genuine prophecy, or did he stopped. Tried to formulate the question correctly. Was the shape of my life built around something real, or was the prophecy also a construction? The ward stone was quiet for a moment. Then it showed him something, not the text of the prophecy, it didn't have access to that, but a shape. A quality. The particular magical resonance of genuine prophetic magic, ancient and impersonal and utterly without agenda, as different from constructed compulsion as natural stone was different from poured concrete. And alongside it, in sharp contrast, the angular deliberate pattern of the contracts, engineered, purposed, human in their intent. Two different things. The prophecy was real. Harry leaned his forehead against the ward stone for a moment and breathed. The prophecy was real, and it was his, and Dumbledore hadn't fabricated it. But what Dumbledore had done, the 980 things he had done in response to it, those were his choices. His extrapolations. The prophecy had said what it said, and a man had heard it and decided that its demands justified everything, and that decision was Dumbledore's and no one else's. Real prophecy. Chosen response. Thank you, Harry said to the stone. The ward light pulsed once, warm and certain, and Harry stood back up and went upstairs to find Hermione and tell her what they were working with. Chapter 5, The Last Gambit of a Certain Kind of Man. The full inquiry was set for the following Thursday. Dumbledore spent the intervening days moving through the castle with the unhurried composure of someone who had decided that composure was itself a strategy. He attended meals. He walked the corridors. He spoke with students who approached him with the warm, attentive patience that had always been his most disarming quality. He had been suspended as headmaster. McGonagall had taken the role immediately and moved into it with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been doing the actual work for years and simply hadn't had the title, but he was permitted to remain on the grounds pending the full inquiry, and he used that permission to be visible. Harry watched him do it and understood exactly what it was. Dumbledore was building a record of himself as a calm, present, beloved figure in the days before the tribunal that would decide his future. He was reminding people what they stood to lose. It was sophisticated and it was human and it was, Harry thought, probably going to work on a significant portion of the witness pool. It wasn't going to work on Harry. On Monday, Hermione's contact in the Department of Mysteries came through. Not in person, it was a sealed document delivered by Ministry courier, addressed to Hermione Granger, marked with the distinctive black wax seal of the Unspeakable's office. Hermione opened it in the library with Harry and Neville watching, and extracted a single sheet of parchment that contained the full text of Prophecy Record 2026, Shelf 7, Row 49, as registered in the Hall of Prophecy in 1980. The prophecy said exactly what Dumbledore had told Harry it said, the night in his office after the Department of Mysteries. Word for word. No additions, no omissions. Hermione read it twice. So he didn't change it, she said. No, Harry said. But he chose the interpretation. Yes. She set the parchment down and looked at it with the focused attention she brought to problems she was solving rather than problems she was feeling. The prophecy specifies that the one with the power to vanquish Voldemort approaches, born as the seventh month dies, to parents who have thrice defied him, marked as his equal. It says the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, and that neither can live while the other survives. She tapped the parchment. What it doesn't say, not anywhere, not in any clause, is that the person needs to be socially engineered from birth. It doesn't say he needs to be surrounded by magically compelled companions. It doesn't say anything about blood contracts, or manufactured family bonds, or any of the architecture Dumbledore built. She looked up. The prophecy identifies Harry as the person. It doesn't specify the methodology of preparation. Which means Dumbledore chose the methodology himself, Neville said from his corner. And then used the prophecy as the justification. Precisely, Hermione said. And that's the argument. She pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward her. We need to present this at the tribunal in a way that separates the prophecy from the methodology completely. Force the adjudicators to evaluate the contracts on their own terms, not as necessary components of fulfilling a genuine prophecy. Dumbledore will argue necessity, Harry said. That even if the prophecy didn't specify methodology, the conditions around the prophecy, Voldemort's power, the urgency, the stakes, created a necessity that justified extraordinary measures. And we counter with intent, Hermione said. The contracts predate several of the specific circumstances Dumbledore will use to argue necessity. Some of them were written before Voldemort made specific moves Dumbledore will reference. The chronology undermines the necessity argument because the contracts weren't reactive. They were proactive. She was already writing. He didn't build the machine in response to a crisis. He built the machine in anticipation of one. That's planning, not necessity. And planning implies agency, and agency implies choice. Harry looked at her writing for a moment. You've been building this argument since the second day, he said. Since the first day, actually, she said. I started building it when I read the first contract entry and realized the dates were going to be important. She glanced up briefly. I didn't want to say anything until I had the prophecy text to confirm the gap. Hermione. Yes. You're extraordinary, Harry said simply. She looked faintly startled by the directness of it, the way she sometimes was when someone said something without preamble or social scaffolding. Then she said, I know. Now let me finish. He left her to it and went to find Ron. Ron was in the sixth-year common room with Seamus and Dean, occupying the three-way dynamic Harry recognized from years of observation, Dean and Seamus generating ambient social warmth, Ron providing the kind of dry, precise commentary that made other people funnier by giving them the right audience. It looked normal. It looked, in fact, almost aggressively normal, in the way that people sometimes recreate the familiar when the ground beneath them has shifted, not to pretend the shift hasn't happened but to confirm that some things remain what they were. Harry sat down in the empty chair and the four of them spent an hour talking about Quidditch with the comfortable specificity of people who know a subject well enough to argue about it without any of the argument being personal. Ron was, Harry noted, slightly different. There was a quality to his conversational engagement that was harder to pin down than to observe, a looseness, a lack of the slight careful monitoring that Harry now realized had always been present underneath Ron's friendliness. The monitoring was gone. What remained was just Ron being in a room with people he liked, without any background process running. It was, Harry thought, the first time he'd ever seen Ron fully at rest. Wednesday evening, he met Percy. The meeting happened in Hogsmeade, at a corner table in the three broomsticks that Percy had chosen with the strategic awareness of someone who wanted exits and sight lines, which was a very Percy thing to consider and also, Harry thought, a fairly reasonable instinct given current circumstances. Percy arrived before them, already seated, already straight-backed, already looking like someone who had rehearsed this conversation several times and was now dealing with the uncomfortable reality that rehearsed conversations generally went wrong at the first word. Ron slid in across from him. Harry sat beside Ron. Percy looked at Harry first, and the look was complex in the way that Percy's face was always complex, layers of calculation visible on the surface because Percy had never quite mastered the art of concealment that the rest of his family wore more naturally. He looked like someone who had spent years being defensive as a survival mechanism and was trying to determine whether this was a context in which the mechanism was still necessary. Percy, Ron said. Ron. Percy's voice was controlled, which cost him something visible. Potter. He looked between them. Thank you for coming. You said you wanted to talk, Ron said. Yes. Percy looked at his hands for a moment. I've been reviewing the last 3 years. My decisions. The ministry work, the separation from the family, he stopped. Harry could see him choosing between the comfortable, formal language he usually retreated to and something more honest, and watching him choose was like watching someone take a jump they'd been standing at the edge of for too long. I was an absolute arse, Percy said. For 3 years. And I told myself it was ambition and principle and that the family didn't understand the importance of what I was doing, and I told myself that so many times that I almost believed it, and now, his jaw tightened. And now I find out that the contract specifically targeted my ambition to suppress it, and my response to that suppression was to pursue the ambition harder and be awful to everyone in my proximity while doing it. And he stopped again. You don't have to explain all of it tonight, Ron said. I want to, Percy said. The control in his voice wobbled slightly at the edges. I want to because I spent 3 years not saying the right things to the people who mattered and I am not doing that anymore. He looked at Ron directly. I was wrong. About the ministry, about Fudge, about you and Harry specifically, about what was worth protecting. I was wrong and I was so deeply certain that I was right that I couldn't see it, and some of that was the contract working against the grain of who I actually am, and some of it was just, me. Making bad choices and defending them. Ron was quiet for a moment. Then, how is it? Now that it's dissolved. Percy looked down at his hands again. Strange, he said. Like, you know when a room has a smell and you've been in it so long you stop noticing it, and then you leave and come back and suddenly the smell is all you can detect? He paused. The absence of it is louder than the presence was. Ron nodded, recognizing that. Yeah. I keep reaching for it, Percy said. Some decision or some judgment, and I reach for the familiar framing and it's not quite there, and I have to work out what I actually think without the background hum of the contract running underneath. He looked up. It's disconcerting. But it's also, a long pause, cleaner. It's cleaner. Harry said, "For what it's worth, I think the version of you that pushed back against magical suppression of your ambition, even without knowing that's what you were doing, that took something. It cost you things. The contract was working against you, and you pushed back against it anyway, and you're still here." Percy looked at him. He looked like someone who has been expecting a blow and received something else entirely and hasn't recalibrated yet. "I didn't handle the pushing back well," he said. "No," Harry agreed. "But you did it." They stayed for 2 hours. By the end, it wasn't resolved. 3 years of separation and a magical history of manipulation didn't resolve in 2 hours over butterbeer, but it was started, and starting was the important thing. When they left, Percy and Ron walked side by side out of the 3 broomsticks, not talking, but close, and that was more than they'd managed in years. Thursday arrived with the quality of days that have been building toward themselves. The sky above Hogwarts was heavy and grey, the kind of sky that considered rain and decided against it but wanted to keep the option open. Harry ate breakfast without tasting it, went to the library to review the presentation with Hermione one final time, and was in the Great Hall with 20 minutes to spare. The full inquiry was a larger assembly than the preliminary session. The 3 adjudicators were back in their silver-grey robes, but the bench had been extended to accommodate 2 additional ICW representatives who had apparently decided the preliminary ruling warranted senior observation. The ministry had sent a larger delegation, including a Wizengamot observer who sat with the particular rigid expression of someone on a political tightrope. The Gringotts team was present, Griphook among them, occupying their section of the chamber with the settled confidence of people who considered themselves the most prepared party in the room and were probably right. Dumbledore was in his chair to the right, and this morning he was different. Not dramatically different. Not obviously. But Harry saw it the moment he came in, something had changed in the composure, the way the composure was being carried. It was heavier. More deliberate. Like something that previously came naturally was now being maintained by active effort. Harry sat down and looked at him, and Dumbledore met his eyes across the chamber, and held them for 3 full seconds before looking away. 3 seconds was a long time, for Albus Dumbledore. Delacroix opened the session with the same clean efficiency she'd brought to the preliminary, summarizing the findings of the initial ruling and outlining the purpose of the full inquiry, to establish final accountability, to determine remediation, and to rule on the future status of the operative, meaning Dumbledore's legal standing and his professional authority. The morning session was technical. Griphook presented Gringotts' full documentation, 5 years of meticulous record-keeping that cross-referenced every single one of the 980 contracts against the corresponding magical signature, the Potter Vault interference logs, and the bloodline resonance analyses that the bank had run quietly and completely without anyone asking them to. The Gringotts presentation was devastatingly thorough, delivered in the clipped, unemotional manner of goblin financial testimony, which was more effective than emotion would have been because it offered no target for emotional counterargument. Then Hermione presented. She stood at the witness bench with her documentation organized with military precision and delivered the chronological analysis that she and Harry had built together, and she did it with the calm authority of someone who knows the material at a depth that makes nervousness irrelevant. She laid out the timeline, the contract density spikes, the correlation with dark activity, the gap between what the prophecy specified and what Dumbledore had chosen. She presented it without commentary, letting the data carry the argument, which was a choice Harry recognized as exactly correct because commentary invited challenge and clean data did not. When she reached the prophecy analysis, the section where she demonstrated, line by line, that the prophecy text contained no directive for the methodology Dumbledore had employed, the Wizengamot observer shifted in his seat and made a note. Rosenberg asked 3 clarifying questions, each one more specific than the last, in the manner of someone testing the edges of an argument to see where it gave. It didn't give anywhere. Hermione answered each question with the precision of someone who has already stress-tested every potential weak point and reinforced it. Dumbledore's ministry lawyer made an objection about the evidentiary basis for the prophecy text's admission. Delacroix sustained it for approximately 4 seconds and then dismissed it on the grounds that the Unspeakable's office had provided the document under official seal, which constituted sufficient evidentiary weight for a tribunal of this level, and could the ministry please refrain from objecting to things it had itself provided. The morning session ended. Harry ate a sandwich in the corridor without tasting it. Ron was in the gallery and found him briefly between sessions, and said nothing, just handed him a second sandwich and went back to his seat. Harry ate the second sandwich and felt, despite everything, somewhat better. The afternoon session was Dumbledore's. He came to the witness bench unhurried, as he'd come to everything, and he composed himself with the particular deliberate stillness of someone who has thought very carefully about how they want to occupy space in a high-stakes room. He looked at the adjudicators with genuine engagement. He looked, briefly and without performance, at Harry. He spoke for 30 minutes. His argument was everything Harry and Hermione had predicted: necessity, prophecy, extraordinary danger, the weight of responsibility for a world that didn't know it needed protecting, the calculus of harm reduction, the genuine love for Harry personally and the Weasley family individually, the relationships that had become real regardless of their origins, the people who had survived and thrived and grown in the context he had carefully constructed. He was compelling. Harry acknowledged this to himself without sentiment, because being honest about your opponent's strengths was basic strategy. Dumbledore was the most persuasive person Harry had ever encountered, and the thing that made him most persuasive was the thing Harry had identified days ago: he believed everything he said. Every word was genuine. The love was genuine. The concern was genuine. The certainty that he had done what was necessary was so deep and so real that it was essentially a physical presence in the room. And that was the problem. That was exactly the problem. Harry waited until Dumbledore finished. Then Delacroix said, "Mr. Potter, you may address the testimony directly." Harry stood up. He didn't go to the witness bench this time. He stood where he was in the chamber, which was different from where witnesses stood, and this was deliberate. He was not testifying, he was responding, and the distinction mattered. "Professor Dumbledore," he said, "you've described the love you have for me and for the Weasley family as real and genuine. I believe you. I believe it completely." He paused. "I want you to answer one question for me directly. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to contextualize it. Just answer it." Dumbledore looked at him steadily. "Of course," he said. "If I had known," Harry said. "If you had come to me at 10 years old, or 11, or 12, at any point before now, and told me the truth. About the prophecy, about the danger, about what you believed I was going to have to face. If you had told me everything and asked me to choose whether to engage with it, to choose the people around me, to choose my own path through it. If I had known and chosen freely." He held Dumbledore's gaze. "Do you think I would have made a different choice?" Dumbledore was silent. "Because I don't," Harry said. "I would have fought. I would have chosen to fight. I would have chosen the Weasleys, maybe not all of them immediately, but Ron on that train, yes. Absolutely yes. I would have chosen Hermione. I would have chosen this castle and this world and the work of protecting it, because that is who I am, and it was who I was at 11 years old, and you knew it." His voice was still perfectly level, still calm, and the calm was real now, not the performed calm of controlled anger but the genuine calm of someone who has arrived at the center of something after a long walk and can finally stand still. "You knew I would choose it. And you took the choice away anyway." Dumbledore looked at him, and for the first time in Harry's entire memory of him, Dumbledore looked genuinely uncertain. Not wrong-footed, not strategically confused, but actually uncertain, in the deep way. The way a man looks when a structure he has built over 60 years develops a crack he cannot locate, because the crack is in the foundation. "You did not need to engineer me," Harry said. "You needed to trust me. And you couldn't do it. Not because I was untrustworthy, but because trusting me meant accepting that the outcome was not entirely within your control. And you could not live with that." He paused one final time. That is not love, Professor. That is fear. And everything you built, every contract, every managed relationship, every carefully constructed circumstance, was built out of fear wearing love's face. The chamber was absolutely silent. Then Dumbledore said, quietly, into the silence, yes. And then, after a moment, you are right. It was not a dramatic admission. It was not loud or broken or theatrically remorseful. It was what it was, a man of enormous intellect and genuine feeling finally arriving at a truth he had been running from for 60 years, and arriving at it not because he was broken but because someone had handed him a mirror and refused to look away while he looked into it. The silence held for a moment longer. Then Nakamura made a note, and the moment passed into the formal record and became part of the permanent architecture of what had happened here. Delacroix called a 20-minute recess. In the corridor, Harry stood by a window and looked out at the grounds and breathed. The ward light in the stones at his back pulsed steadily. He felt, not triumphant. That wasn't the word. He felt the particular exhaustion that came after something had been completed correctly, the specific weight of a long-held tension releasing. It wasn't over. There was still the ruling, still the remediation, still the long process of untangling 3 decades of managed architecture. But the central confrontation, the one he had been building towards since he'd put his hand on that stone in the entrance hall, that was done. Ron appeared beside him. "How are you doing?" "I'm all right," Harry said. And meant it. "That was something," Ron said. He was looking out the window too. "What you said in there. It needed saying." "Yeah." Ron was quiet for a moment. "You know what I keep thinking about? That you asked him if you would have chosen differently." A pause. "And I keep thinking, I would have chosen to be your friend. Without a contract. I know that. I can feel the difference now and I know that." He didn't look at Harry when he said it, kept his eyes on the grounds, which was exactly how Ron delivered the things that mattered most to him, the things he said sideways because they were too important for direct approach. "I just wanted you to know." Harry looked at him. At the familiar profile, the freckles, the jaw that went tight when Ron was feeling something he considered too large for casual mention. "I know," Harry said. Ron nodded. Neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed saying. When the recess ended and the chamber reassembled, Dumbledore asked to make a final statement. Delacroix permitted it. He stood at the witness bench for the last time. He was older looking than he'd been this morning, not differently old, but more visibly so, as though the day had settled something in him that had previously been held in suspension. "I would like to say," he said, "for the record, and to the specific people in this room whom my actions most affected, that what Harry has said is accurate. I made choices that were mine to make, and I attributed to necessity what was, in fact, ambition of a different kind. The ambition to control an outcome I was afraid to leave to the genuine agency of the people within it." He paused. "I do not expect this acknowledgement to be received as sufficient. It is not sufficient. It is simply true." He looked at Harry. He looked at the gallery, where Ron and Neville and Hermione sat. He looked, last, at the walls of the castle, the ancient stones that had waited 50 years to say what needed to be said. And then something happened that Harry hadn't expected. The castle responded. Not warmly. Not with the welcome pulse Harry was accustomed to. But with something more complicated, a low, slow resonance from deep in the foundation stones, the sound of something very old considering a very complex thing and rendering a verdict. Not forgiveness, the castle wasn't in the business of forgiveness, that wasn't what old things did with harm. But acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of having heard something real, coming from a source that had not heard a great deal of genuine truth from this particular man over the course of 60 years. Dumbledore looked at the walls. His expression did something that Harry had no vocabulary for, something that lived in the space between grief and peace, where things ended. The formal ruling came at 4 in the afternoon. Dumbledore's headmaster status was permanently revoked. His wand would undergo a 3-year supervised restriction, limited to defensive use only, monitored by the ICW and Gringotts jointly. He was barred from any magical governance role for 10 years. The 980 blood contracts were formally dissolved in their entirety. Many had already been broken by the ward dissolution, but the formal legal declaration covered every one. Gringotts was authorized to pursue financial remediation on behalf of the affected families. The ministry was required to file a public disclosure of the tribunal findings within 30 days. Dumbledore accepted the ruling without objection. As the chamber emptied, Harry saw Snape cross the room with deliberate purpose and stop beside Dumbledore. He didn't watch what passed between them, it wasn't his to watch. But he saw Snape's posture, and it was different from any posture Harry had seen from him before. Not deferential. Not defensive. Something that might have been, in a complicated and qualified and very Snape-specific way, the posture of a person choosing freely. McGonagall found Harry near the door. "I want you to know," she said, "that I will be speaking to the full faculty tonight about what needs to change in the way this school is run. And I would like your input." She paused, and something in her expression was direct and specific and meant precisely what it said. As a student who has been in this castle longer than most, and who knows it better than anyone currently on staff, Harry said, "I'll be there." She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and what passed between them was the acknowledgement of something that had been building for 6 years, a mutual recognition that had always been present and was only now being spoken in complete sentences. "Good," she said, and went to find the faculty. Harry went back to the ward chamber below the main floor, alone, for the last time before the renewal window closed. The ward stones were settling, the brilliant blue-white light dimming slowly back to its dormant state as the renewal cycle moved toward completion. He put his hand on the central stone, which was warm and enormous and breathing in its slow massive way, and he didn't ask it anything. He just stayed there for a moment, with the oldest thing he'd ever touched, in the place that had been his first real home. "Thank you," he said. "For showing him. For waiting until it could. For choosing him as the person to show." The stone pulsed once, warm and complete. And in that pulse Harry felt, very clearly, the entirety of what the castle was, 1,000 years of accumulated knowing, of children growing up inside its walls, of magic laying itself down layer by layer into the stone, of a living thing watching and remembering and caring, in its vast and unhurried way, about every person who had ever looked up at its towers and felt, against all expectation, that they were home. The light dimmed. The renewal window closed. Harry took his hand off the stone. He went upstairs. There was still work to do. Chapter 6, What We Choose. October came into Hogwarts quietly, the way October always did, not announcing itself but simply replacing September while no one was watching, swapping the sharp bright light for something more amber and considered, dropping the temperature by degrees too gradual to argue with. The castle settled into the season with the ease of something that had done this 1,000 times and found it neither novel nor unremarkable, just the continuing business of existing through time. Harry noticed it on a Tuesday morning when he came down to breakfast and the enchanted ceiling was doing something it only did in autumn, catching the particular angle of October light and holding it in the stone, so that the great hall glowed a warm gold that had nothing to do with the candles. He stood in the doorway for a moment just looking at it, the long tables filling with students, the sound of morning conversation layering itself into the familiar texture of a school at work, and he felt something that took him a moment to identify because it was simple enough to be unfamiliar. He felt like he lived here. Not as a place he'd been assigned. Not as a controlled environment. As home, chosen and specific and his. He went and sat down across from Ron. Ron was halfway through a plate of eggs and reading a letter with the focused squint he brought to anything that required parsing subtext. He had a quill behind one ear and ink on his left hand, which meant he'd already been writing something this morning, which meant Percy had written again. Their correspondence had become, in the 3 weeks since Hogsmeade, something frequent and careful and apparently mutual, Percy writing in his layered, formal way, Ron responding in the direct, slightly graceless prose that was more honest for its gracelessness, each of them working toward something that didn't have a name yet but was clearly growing toward one. Good morning, Harry said. He wants to come for Halloween, Ron said, without looking up. Percy. He wants to come for the feast. What do you want? Harry asked. Ron looked up then. Considered. Yeah, he said. I think I do. He put the letter down. Mum's been writing too. Have you been getting letters from her? Too, Harry said. Are they? Careful, Harry said. She's being very careful. Like someone walking across ice and checking every step. He picked up his fork. I'm not ready to respond yet. But I will be. Ron nodded, accepting this without pushing it. The acceptance was new, not the acceptance itself, because Ron had always been capable of it, but the ease of it. The absence of the background strain Harry now recognized, retrospectively, as the contract doing its work. He thought, not for the first time, about what Hermione had said, whatever you find on the other side of those contracts, let people show you who they choose to be. Ron was showing him, day by day, in the accumulated evidence of ordinary mornings and unremarkable conversations and the specific way he passed the pumpkin juice without being asked. It was enough. It was more than enough. Hermione arrived at the table with the particular purposeful energy of someone who had been up since 6 and had already accomplished 3 things. She sat down, poured herself tea, and said, without preamble, Fred and George have a working prototype. Harry put his fork down. Already? They tested it last night on themselves. They needed a baseline reading from someone who'd been under a dissolved contract, apparently, to calibrate the offset detection. George said it took 40 minutes to tune and then it worked immediately. She wrapped both hands around her mug. They want to show you this morning. After breakfast, Harry said. They said you'd say that. Fred said to tell you they'll be in the Charms classroom on the 3rd floor. She paused. He also said, and I'm quoting, that if you don't come before 9 he'll test it on a first tie and explain to McGonagall that you gave him permission. Ron said, he's bluffing. He's definitely not, Harry said. After breakfast, he went to the 3rd floor Charms classroom. Fred and George had occupied it with the comfortable thoroughness of people who considered any empty room a legitimate working space pending formal objection. The desks had been pushed to the walls. The blackboard from their dormitory was propped against the teacher's desk, the runic notation from 2 weeks ago supplemented with several new layers of calculation in different colors of chalk, creating a palimpsest of working that would have been illegible to most people and was clearly a complete and precise record to its authors. Fred was at the board. George was at one of the desks, writing something with quick, neat strokes. They both looked up when Harry came in, and for the first time in the weeks since the expulsion, they looked fully settled in their own skins. Not the performance of it. Actually settled. Right on time, Fred said. What does it do exactly? Harry asked, looking at the board. Single incantation, wand-based diagnostic, George said, capping his quill. Cast it at a person, it reads their magical signature and scans specifically for the offset quality of externally fed contract binding, the thing Fred described, where the contract sits like a shadow that doesn't quite match. He held up his wand, which had a thin strip of parchment tied around its handle with what appeared to be a very fine copper wire. The wire is a resonance conductor, it amplifies the scan's sensitivity. We'll patent it separately, the wire component. The spell itself is standalone. Show me, Harry said. George pointed his wand at Fred and said, Revello Nexum. Nothing visible happened for a moment. Then a faint shimmer ran over Fred's surface, not quite light, more like the visual effect of heat rising from stone, and it resolved cleanly without any anomaly. No offset. No shadow. Fred gave Harry a look that was both satisfied and still slightly raw around its edges, the look of someone who is glad of a clean result and is working hard not to feel too much about what a dirty result would have meant. No active contracts, George confirmed. We ran it on 30 students last night after curfew, while they were sleeping. Harry said. They were in the common room, Harry, it was only 10 o'clock, Fred said, with the tone of someone who considers this an important distinction. 28 clean results. 2 flags. Harry went still. 2 flags. Both Gryffindors. Both 6th years. George met his eyes. Neither of them are names from the ward ledger. Which means these are either contracts we missed in the ledger, possible, if they were buried deep enough that even the renewal didn't surface them, or they're new contracts. Written after the renewal. The room was quiet for a moment. Written after, Harry said. Meaning someone placed new contracts in the last 3 weeks. That's the worse option, Fred said. Yes, Harry said. Who are the 2 students? Fred and George looked at each other. That's the part we wanted you here for, George said. Because one of them is Katie Bell. Harry thought for a moment. 6th year Gryffindor. Chaser. Been at Hogwarts since his year. He couldn't immediately connect her to Dumbledore's architecture, which was the point. If she wasn't in the original ledger, whoever had written her contract was either someone who'd learned from Dumbledore's methods or someone who had been operating parallel to him all along. And the second, he said. Cormac McLaggen, George said. Harry looked at him. McLaggen was loud, self-important, and chronically overconfident, which made him an unlikely subject for subtle magical manipulation, which was exactly why it worked. People didn't look for contracts in people they found irritating rather than significant. What are the terms? Can you read them from the diagnostic? Not full terms, Fred said. The diagnostic flags the presence and the operative's magical signature. It doesn't decrypt the terms, that requires a full dissolution, which requires an ICW certification. He paused. But the signature is readable. And? George said, quietly, it's not Dumbledore's signature. The weight of this landed in the room and settled. Harry looked at the blackboard. He looked at the copper wire on George's wand. He looked at the 2 of them, and thought about what it meant that someone other than Dumbledore had been running this kind of operation, someone currently unknown, and that the ICW ruling and the ward renewal and everything that had happened over the past 3 weeks had not in fact cleared the field. It had only revealed how much larger the field was. I need to take this to McGonagall, Harry said. And to Delacroix, she may still be in the country. We know, Fred said. We wanted to show you first. Harry looked at him. Why? Fred gave him the sharp look, the real one, not the performance. Because you're the one who made the castle show us what was there. Because you're the one who stood up in that tribunal and said the things that needed saying. Because, he stopped, seemed to decide that further explanation was unnecessary, because you've earned the first look. That's why. Harry said nothing for a moment. Then he held out his hand. Let me borrow the wand with the wire. I want to test something before we go to McGonagall. George handed it over without hesitation. Harry cast Revello Nexum on himself. The shimmer ran over him and resolved cleanly, no offset, no shadow. He hadn't expected anything different, but he'd needed to confirm it the way you sometimes needed to confirm things you already knew, not for information but for the solid ground of certainty. Then he pointed it at the wall. The shimmer ran through the stone and the ward light flared briefly in response, and in that brief flare Harry could see something, not a contract, not the offset quality the spell was designed to flag, but a layer of magic in the stones that was older than anything else he'd scanned, old enough to predate the notion of blood contracts entirely, old enough to have a quality of intention that was completely different from engineered compulsion. The castle's magic was its own. The castle's magic had always been its own, accumulating and growing and becoming aware entirely on its own terms. He handed the wand back to George. It's good work, he said. And meant it fully. Fred and George both received this with the particular combination of genuine pride and total equanimity that was one of their defining characteristics, and Fred made a note on the board, and they began breaking down the working space with efficient practicality, and Harry went to find McGonagall. McGonagall's office smelled, now, exactly the way it should, like parchment and sharp tea and the particular mineral smell of old stone. Dumbledore's various instruments were gone from the shelves, cleared out 2 weeks ago, and the space they'd occupied had been filled with McGonagall's own things, transfiguration texts with marked pages, a large star chart pinned to the wall, a ceramic mug that said Deputy Headmistress that someone had clearly not yet updated. She was at her desk when Harry knocked and came in, and she looked up from what appeared to be a staff timetabling document with the expression of someone who has been trying to solve a quadratic equation using only mental arithmetic. "Potter," she said. "Sit down." He sat, and told her about the prototype and the 2 flagged students and the foreign magical signature. She listened without interrupting, which was one of McGonagall's great skills, the ability to receive information completely before responding to it, to let the full shape of something exist before she began working on it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You believe these are newly placed contracts," she said. "The prototype distinguishes between residual dissolved contract signatures and active ones. Fred is very precise about that distinction in his methodology. 2 students. A foreign operative." She tapped one finger on her desk. "This is not a Dumbledore affiliate. The tribunal would have surfaced any known associates." She looked at Harry. "This is independent. A separate operation, either existing parallel to Dumbledore's or established in the chaos following the tribunal while our attention was elsewhere." "That's my read," Harry said. She was quiet again. "Then, I will contact Delacroix today. She is still in Edinburgh. I had a letter from her 3 days ago regarding the remediation process." She looked at the mug that still said Deputy Headmistress. "In the meantime, I want you to speak with neither Katie nor Cormac about this. Anyone who holds an active contract is vulnerable to the contract's response mechanisms. Most blood contracts contain an alert clause that notifies the operative if the subject becomes aware of the binding." "I know," Harry said. "I read it in the ledger. Clause 4 in most of the Dumbledore contracts." She looked at him with the expression she sometimes wore when he demonstrated that he had been paying close, thorough attention to something she hadn't yet had reason to check. "Yes," she said. "Clause 4. A pause. "I am going to ask you something, Potter, and I want an honest answer." "All right. How are you?" She said it with the specific directness that meant it wasn't a social question, it was a real one. Harry considered it with the same honesty. "Better than I was a month ago," he said. "Still finding things out about what was real and what wasn't. Letting that take the time it takes." He looked at the window, the October sky beyond it. "There are good days. I had a really good Quidditch practice on Saturday. Ron and I stayed up until 2 in the morning talking about absolutely nothing important on Wednesday. Hermione cried on Thursday. Finally, she'd been holding it together for 3 weeks and she finally let herself be upset about it, and it was actually a relief to see because she'd been so determinedly functional." He paused. "I'm all right. I think I'm more all right than I've been in years, which is strange given the circumstances, but the circumstances changed something fundamental and some of what changed is good." McGonagall looked at him steadily. "The circumstances removed a scaffolding you've been living inside," she said. "Scaffolding can be supportive. It can also be a cage. When it goes, the structure either stands or it doesn't." "I'm standing," Harry said. "Yes," she said. "You are." Something moved in her expression that she didn't quite suppress, something that was almost, carefully, maternal. "Good. Now go to your morning classes. I'll send for you when Delacroix confirms her availability." Harry stood. At the door he stopped and turned back. "Professor." "The mug." She looked at it. "What about it?" "It should say Headmistress," he said. She looked at it for a moment longer. Then she said, "It should," with a quiet decisiveness that closed the matter completely. Ginny found him on the Friday of that week. He was at the edge of the lake in the late afternoon, sitting on a flat rock with his potions essay and not writing it. The lake was dark and still, and occasionally the giant squid moved somewhere far out and disturbed the surface in slow, peaceful rings. He'd been here for an hour, not really working, mostly just being outside in the cold October air, which his body seemed to require at regular intervals as a condition of continued functionality. He heard her coming because she made no effort to be quiet. She sat down on the rock beside him, not close enough to be in his space but not far enough to suggest distance was the point, and she looked at the lake and said nothing for a while. Harry waited. He'd learned, with Ginny, that the right move was almost always to wait. "I want to tell you something," she said eventually. "All right. I've been thinking about the contract." She had her knees pulled up, her arms around them, looking at the water. Specifically about how it worked, technically, based on what Fred explained. The resonant family magic feed. The way it sat in you like a shadow offset from your real self. She paused. "And I've been trying to identify, specifically, precisely, which parts of what I felt came from that and which parts were mine. Like I was trying to audit my own emotional history." "How's that going?" Harry asked. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Terribly. You can't audit your own feelings like a ledger. They don't line up in columns." She looked sideways at him. "What I've figured out, though, what I keep coming back to, is that the contract was written in 1992. I was 11. And what an 11-year-old feels is simple things. Excitement. Admiration. The big, uncomplicated feelings." She paused again, longer this time. "But I'm 16 now. And what I feel now is, it's not simple. It's got specific things in it that have nothing to do with Harry Potter the famous person and everything to do with, you. Specifically. The actual person sitting on this rock not writing his potions essay." She stopped. Harry waited. "I can't tell you whether the root of it was the contract," she said. "I genuinely can't. But I think the root doesn't matter as much as what grew from it. And I think what grew from it is mine. The question is whether," she stopped herself, changed direction, "the question is what you want. What you actually want. Not the contractually convenient version." Harry looked at her. At the profile he'd been looking at for a year in a different way than he'd looked at it before, specific and considered and nothing like the broad uncomplicated feeling of being 11 years old. "I want to find out," he said. "Properly. Without any scaffolding. Just, finding out, slowly, what's there." He paused. "If that's something you want." She looked at him directly for the first time in the conversation. "That," she said, "is the first thing anyone has ever said to me about this that didn't feel like it was heading somewhere predetermined." "Good," Harry said. She looked back at the lake. After a moment she reached over and took his potions essay, glanced at it, and said, "You haven't written anything." "I know. The question is asking you to compare the preparation method for strengthening solution against pepper-up potion. It's not actually hard. I know that too." She looked at him sideways. "Do you want help?" "Yes please," Harry said, and passed her the quill. They sat at the lake for another hour, the water going dark around them as the afternoon dropped into evening, and she walked him through the essay with the brisk impatience of someone who finds the work obvious and the person failing to do it simultaneously exasperating and entertaining, and he argued with her methodology in the way that was actually agreement in disguise. And the rock was cold and the lake was beautiful and nothing about it was engineered. Delacroix arrived on Monday. She came with a second adjudicator, not from the original tribunal, a new face, a tall man named Okafor who the Edinburgh magical community apparently considered the foremost expert on covert blood-targeted magic in active practice. They were in McGonagall's office for an hour before anyone sent for Harry, and when he arrived, Okafor was looking at Fred's prototype notes with the intense focus of someone encountering a piece of work that has surprised him. "The copper wire resonance conductor," Okafor said, without looking up, "is a genuinely novel mechanism. This was developed by students. 6th years," Harry said. "Remarkable." He set the notes down. "Mr. Potter. These two flagged students. We will need to verify the flags independently before we can proceed formally, but the methodology appears sound and the signature analysis is consistent with documented active practices. He looked up. He had a careful, precise face, the face of someone who assembled his words the way a watchmaker assembled mechanisms, nothing extraneous. The signature does not match any operative in the ICW's current registry of known blood contract practitioners. Which means it's someone new, Harry said. Or someone who's never been caught. Or someone operating under a masked signature, Delacroix said. She was at the window, looking at the grounds. Which requires a level of sophistication that narrows the field considerably. How narrow? Harry asked. Sufficiently narrow that we have a working list of possible operatives, she said. 5 names. 2 of them deceased. 1 currently in Azkaban. She turned from the window. The remaining 2 are individuals who have been on the ICW's watch list for separate reasons for some years. Can you tell me the names? She looked at him steadily. Not yet. When we have confirmed identification from the flag verification, yes. She paused, and something shifted in her expression, the professional composure admitting a fractional personal note. Mr. Potter. I want to say something outside the formal record. She glanced at McGonagall, who gave a slight nod. What you did 3 weeks ago, the way you handled this from the night of the ward renewal through the full tribunal, was exemplary. Not merely for your age. For anyone. The precision of your documentation, the quality of your testimony, the strategic intelligence of your presentation. She held his gaze. The ICW has an observer program for young magical practitioners who demonstrate exceptional capacity in governance and magical law. It begins in the summer following completion of magical education. I would like to formally recommend you for consideration. Harry looked at her. He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, rather than giving the reflexive response, and found that it landed somewhere interesting, somewhere that wasn't the shape of the future Dumbledore had been building toward but had its own geometry entirely. I'll consider it, he said. Thank you. She nodded once, satisfied, and returned to the window. The flag verification took 3 days. Okafor confirmed both results independently with his own diagnostic, found the same foreign signature on both Katie and Cormac, and cross-referenced it against the ICW's operative registry in a way that produced, on Thursday morning, a confirmed identification. The operative was a witch named Estelle Vane. She was 47 years old, British-born, and had spent the last decade operating out of Amsterdam. She had 2 previous flags on the ICW's watch list for blood contract activity in the Netherlands, both insufficiently evidenced for formal action at the time. She had, apparently, watched the Hogwarts tribunal with considerable professional interest and decided that the removal of Dumbledore's architecture presented an opportunity, a vulnerable high-value target, newly exposed, with its existing network of contracts dissolved and its protection stripped. She had moved quickly and quietly and had been very nearly clean. Fred and George's prototype had 3 weeks on her. The ICW moved the same day the identification was confirmed. Delacroix issued an arrest warrant. The Amsterdam office executed it before nightfall. Estelle Vane was in ICW custody by Friday morning. Katie Bell and Cormac McLagan were dissolved with the same procedure Bill had used on the Weasleys, a Gringotts cursebreaker and an ICW witness, this time in McGonagall's office rather than on the grounds. They were told the full situation with the straightforward honesty that McGonagall had decided would characterize her headmistress' tenure as a policy, and both of them sat with it in the different ways their personalities allowed, Katie with a quiet, thorough stillness, Cormac with the particular loud discomfort of someone who doesn't know how to process the idea that they were targeted and is disguising that as general outrage about the mechanism. Harry told Fred and George that evening. They received it with the combination of satisfaction and continued alertness that he'd come to recognize as their working state, pleased with the result, already thinking about the next application. We've had 6 owls, Fred said. About the prototype? Harry asked. About the prototype, George confirmed. Word got around the curse-breaking community that something new and effective had been used to support an ICW operation. Gringotts sent 2 independent curse-breakers. One from the French ministry. One from, he checked his notebook, the South African Magical Governance Council. Harry looked at them. At the chalkboard behind them, now covered so many layers deep in working that the original runic notation was buried under weeks of development. At the comfortable, assured intelligence that had spent 6 years hiding behind spectacular mischief and was now, released from a contract that had been quietly suppressing its most ambitious expressions, doing exactly what it was built to do. "You're going to build something real," Harry said. Fred smiled. Not the performance smile. The real one. "Already building," he said. The Halloween feast was loud and golden and smelled like everything good about autumn, and Percy Weasley sat at the Gryffindor table between Ron and Ginny and looked, for the first time in 3 years, like someone who was in the right place. He'd arrived that afternoon with a briefcase and a formal manner that softened visibly by increments over the course of the day, each hour in the castle dissolving a layer of the professional carapace he'd built around himself. By the time the feast started he was in conversation with Fred and George about magical governance reform, specifically about whether the ICW's blood contract detection protocols should be updated in light of the prototype, and whether a private Wisengamot petition might be the right vehicle, and the three of them were talking the way people talk when they found an interest that makes all the previous difficulty irrelevant, with the urgent, crackling focus of ideas connecting. Ron caught Harry's eye across the table and gave him a look of pure, uncomplicated satisfaction. Harry gave him one back. Hermione was beside Harry, and she'd been quietly happy all evening in the specific way she was happy when things were working the way they should, not loudly, not with commentary, just radiating a steady warmth that was the most reliable thing Harry had ever been near. She was talking to Neville on her other side about herbology, and Neville was explaining something about the magical properties of Mandrake in the register he used when he was completely certain of his ground, which was a register he used more often now than when Harry had first known him. Harry looked down the table. He looked at the faces, Ron and Percy and Fred and George and Ginny, all of them in the same place at the same time, all of them knowing what they knew and still being here. He thought about Molly Weasley's letter, still unanswered on his desk, careful and searching and full of the specific pain of someone trying to be honest from inside a history of dishonesty. He thought about what he'd told Ron, take as long as you need. He thought about what was still ahead, the ongoing remediation, the 980 families that Gringotts was working through systematically, the broader questions about how many other institutions had Dumbledore-shaped histories buried in their foundations, the ICW Observer Program, the prophecy that was still true regardless of everything else and hadn't stopped being his. He thought about all of it and felt it as workable. Genuinely, solidly workable. He thought about the castle. After the feast, when the hall was beginning to clear and people were drifting back to dormitories with the comfortable fullness of a good meal and a good night, Harry stayed behind. He sat at the Gryffindor table alone for a moment in the candlelight, looking at the enchanted ceiling where the Halloween decorations, live bats moving through artificial moonlight, circled overhead in their slow, elegant patterns. The ward light in the walls was its dormant self now, not the brilliant declaration of the renewal but the quiet background warmth that had always been there and that Harry had simply not known how to read before. It was steady. It was constant. The way it had always been, all along, present and alive and paying attention, waiting for someone to notice. He put his hand flat on the Gryffindor table. Not the wall, just the table. Old oak, worn smooth by centuries of elbows and spilled ink and the accumulated weight of 10,000 meals. Not a ward stone. Just a piece of the castle. It was warm. He smiled. "All right," he said quietly, to the room, to the castle, to no one and everyone. "Let's see what's next." The candles burned steadily. The bats circled. Somewhere above him, his friends were walking through corridors lit by ward light that had chosen, of its own old living awareness, to make the path clear. The prophecy sat in the Hall of Prophecy in London in its glass orb, still true, still his, still pointing toward a future that had not yet arrived and that he would walk into on his own terms, with his own people, having chosen every step. He took his hand off the table. He stood up. Outside the tall windows, October had settled fully into the grounds, the trees dark and rich, the lake a mirror of clouded stars, the towers of Hogwarts rising against the sky with the same solidity they had risen with for 1,000 years and would rise with for 1,000 more. Ancient and alive and paying close attention. Harry Potter walked out of the great hall and up toward Gryffindor Tower, and the castle lit his way without being asked, because it knew him, and it trusted him, and it was glad he was home.